Hello and welcome to today's conference of the International Schiller Institute, The Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. We're going to begin today with a musical selection. This is Franz Schubert's An die Musik, and it's being sung by Robert McFerrin and Sylvia Olden Lee. A word about both of them. Robert McFerrin was the first African-American male to sing at the Metropolitan Opera of New York back in 1955. Sylvia Olden Lee, who is the vocal coach and instructor and was also a great friend of Mr. McFerrin, also worked with the Schiller Institute until her untimely death in 2004. This is a performance from 1993, Washington, D.C., of Franz Schubert's An die Musik. I want to note now that you've seen the performance that at the time, Mr. McFerrin was recovering from a stroke and he could not actually speak. He could only sing. And that is sort of the spirit in which we do today's meeting. We have to accomplish a miracle, and that miracle can be accomplished. If you've just joined us, we want to welcome all of you from all around the world to today's International Schiller Institute Conference, The Age of Reason, or the Annihilation of Humanity. We're here to consider a question. Will this decade, which inaugurates, be the one that inaugurates a new age of reason, or witness the annihilation of humanity? We're meeting today to discover how nuclear World War III can be avoided. The World War II madness that killed 100 million people 80 years ago began to be reversed by the victory at Stalingrad, the single bloodiest battle in history, which ended February 2nd, 1943. Today, that same madness may murder 50, 60, 70 times 100 million people. As with the Peace of Westphalia, we must learn to negotiate peace without preconditions, True peace requires planet-wide promotion of the general welfare of humanity and its posterity. Veterans of World War II knew that only by building a just world order that affirms the intrinsic worth of each human life could war ever end. This meant eliminating the objective causes of war itself: poverty, famine, ignorance, and epidemic illness. On February of last year, a memorandum was signed by the nations of China and Russia called Joint Statement on International Relations Entering a New Era. Had that memorandum been welcomed by economies and governments of the transatlantic world, the military actions of February 24th could have been avoided. The outlook expressed in that February 4th memorandum had been anticipated 40 years earlier by Lyndon LaRouche, the great economist, statesman, World War II veteran, and co-founder of the Schiller Institute. It was contained in documents such as his A 50-Year Development Policy for the Pacific Ocean Basin, written in the fall of 1983. In 1997, speaking to an audience in Washington, D.C., LaRouche discussed his history in The Secret of Economic Statecraft, of how to not only provide a sustainable, but an exponentially increasing prosperity and therefore security for all of humanity.
What I shall do today is present the evolution of the policy which is presented to us by the coming visit of the President of China. The history of it, as I was personally involved in developing that policy over a long period of time, partly as a personal effort and later as an effort which began to make some impact on the shaping of the policies of the world during the course of the 1980s. Now, how did this happen? The key event, which is relevant to my role in this, occurred beginning December 1981 and to a period through 1984. In December 1981, I had run as a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1980 against Jimmy Carter. And thus, because of the position I had there, in that respect, as a former presidential candidate, pre-candidate, and because of other things I'd done, that it was decided by some people in the US government that it would be wise to have me as a private citizen respond to a Soviet probe which had requested that an additional back-channel discussion be set up between the Reagan administration and the Soviet government. So I agreed to undertake this exploratory discussion, but made one recommendation, which was conditional in the sense I said, if I'm going to be useful in this kind of discussion, there are certain things I should discuss which are of concern to me, which become the basis for this kind of exploration. I had been concerned for some time with two things. From my time of my military service in China, Burma, India theater during World War II, and I'd been concerned with establishing economic justice for the world after seeing Asia. And that had been my personal commitment, that we must change affairs so that the so-called underdeveloped or former colonial regions of the world could participate in justice. And so I've been involved heavily with third world questions and had gotten myself into a great deal of trouble in certain circles because I had been an advocate of the third world. In one time, the FBI was going to have the Communist Party of the United States assassinate me. There's a government document on that subject back in 1973 as a result of this kind of thing. But in this, the second thing I was concerned about was that the agreements on détente, which had been specifically reached during the course and aftermath of the 1962 missile crisis, were themselves a danger, a risk to civilization. That the system of détente, that is of nuclear mutual deterrence, had become the potential trigger for an accidental war, and that therefore we had to concern ourselves with this problem of ballistic missile defense. So this policy, which I had devised, which was part of my 1980 presidential campaign, a key, shall we say, plank in that campaign, was that the United States should propose to the Soviet Union and other powers that we agree on developing an efficient ballistic missile defense to be common to all powers, so that no longer would we face the threat of thermonuclear extinction with no defense against thermonuclear warhead missiles. And that this collaboration among the United States, the Soviet Union, and other powers should be technological collaboration extended to all nations to the purpose of using these technologies, which were then called in diplomatic language new physical principles, to the benefit of the development of all mankind, with a special emphasis upon what is called then the developing sector. This was the policy which I used as the pivot of my exploratory discussions with the Soviet government during a period from February of 1982 through February of 1983. I had indications from the Andropov government that this would not be acceptable to Andropov, but they were interested in the economics. The President of the United States, in various ways, adopted this idea as a good idea, President Reagan, through his people in the National Security Council with whom I was working. And on March 23rd, 1983, as you recall, the President of the United States brought in a concluding segment of his televised broadcast, announced what he called the Strategic Defense Initiative, whose content was to propose to the Soviet Union exactly what I had outlined to the Soviet government in my back channel talks. That action by the President changed world history. It didn't change it the way I wanted it changed, because very soon the mice, including the Heritage Foundation mice, got at the operation and turned the SD around and changed its purpose. But that concept of using these most advanced technologies, which still exist potentially, and using these as the shared technologies, shared among various nations, technologies based on expansion of the world's machine tool design capability in terms of these new technologies, should be used for transforming the world into the kind of world which, among others, President Franklin Roosevelt intended to put into effect at the end of World War, had he lived to do so.
If you just joined us, we want to welcome you from all over the world to today's International Schiller Institute Conference, The Age of Reason, or the Annihilation of Humanity. You've just heard the late economist, statesman, LaRouche, from a speech he gave in 1997 discussing the secret of economic progress and economic and physical security. We're now going to hear from the founder of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She is speaking on the topic, How to Avoid Nuclear War, the Nature of Man. Good morning, Helga.
Hello. Let me greet you wherever you may be around the globe. If the so-called ordinary citizen would know how close we are to thermonuclear war, and with that the annihilation of mankind, and that therefore everything we lived for and who we love, there would be 8 billion people in the streets demanding an immediate end to the madness of those oligarchical interests who are driving the human species towards extinction. The only people who would not be in the streets would be people who have committed themselves to evil. Boris Johnson and his likes would not be in the streets. The aim of this conference and many similar activities is to create a world movement of world citizens who are faced with the biggest crisis in the history of the human species, work together all over the world in order to establish a new paradigm of cooperation instead of confrontation, a new paradigm in international relations that allows for the life and happiness of every human being on the planet. We must end the war through negotiations immediately, which is why we are organizing worldwide support for the initiative of Pope Francis to offer the venue of the Vatican for negotiations without preconditions. Fortunately, President Lula of Brazil is now forming a peace club of nations of the global south who all support the idea of ending the war through diplomacy and who have clearly refused to be pulled into the geopolitical confrontation between the US and Russia and China. The role of the Pope as the representation of man's nature as being in the image of God and therefore above politics is the ecumenical rallying point which should be strengthened by this peace club, which should be joined by all nations and all organizations as well as individuals. The present crisis is not about Ukraine. It's about the attempt to reconquer control over an unipolar world at a moment when that possibility has irrevocably gone. And it is about the control of the narrative of who is the instigator of this war of aggression. And naturally, the main Western media want us to believe that it is Russia who is the sole culprit in this, quote, unprovoked war of aggression, and that everybody who claims that the war has a prehistory dating back at least to 1991 is automatically labeled as a Putin agent. Every person who is not a moron and has lived consciously through the last 3+ decades must reject this as an insult to his or her intelligence. Just for refreshing our memories, it should be clear that whoever is preparing and conducting a war of aggression, especially a potentially nuclear one, commits a Nuremberg crime. Despite the promises not to expand NATO to the east, it was done. Once it was realized that Putin did not intend to continue the shameful sellout of Russian interest by Yeltsin, and despite warnings such as that of William Burns from the 1st of February 2008, marked confidential, in his capacity as US ambassador in Moscow, that NATO enlargement would be regarded as a threat by Russia, that it would be perceived as encirclement and fear unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences. The Drang nach Osten, the drive to the east, they continued. How hypocritical can politicians in the West be to deny knowledge of the involvement of Victoria Nuland in the 2014 Maidan coup and her oh so ladylike words, F the EU, concerning the decision that puppet Yats should replace the legitimately elected government of President Yanukovych. And should the German BND, the German Exterior Secret Service, really have been so sloppy to misplace the records about the activities of the Stetskos, convinced admirers of Stepan Bandera and their anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations and their support through the Gehlen organization in Munich, the traces of which one finds once one looks into the Maidan coup? To blame Putin as the aggressor when the West could have prevented the war by enforcing the Minsk agreement. And then Merkel and Hollande come out and say, sorry, we never intended that. We just wanted to win some time to prepare the Ukrainian soldiers for the upcoming war, which was obviously regarded as inevitably already in 2014. Merkel and Hollande deserve a place in the Guinness Book of Records for winning the prize in the destruction of trust in international relations. Putin had presented his concerns for the security of Russia already to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, and then dramatically on December 17th, 2021, to the US and NATO, demanding security guarantees guarantees for the core interests of Russia, which were conveniently ignored. And into what category of behavior falls Boris Johnson's intervention in Kiev in March 2022, when there was readiness to seek a negotiated solution on both sides, peace-loving or provoking? The Swiss retired colonel and intelligence expert Jacques Beau just said on February 1 on Sud Radio that the real shift in the Russian strategy occurred last June, when they abandoned the option of negotiations after they realized that the Anglo-Americans and their allies would not allow the Ukrainians to negotiate peace. Now, practically most experts agree that because of Russia's perception that the aim of the West is to, quote, ruin Russia, Baerbock, eradicate Russia from the map, to cut it into different entities for which regime change would be a self-evident precondition, that Russia aims to completely grind the Ukrainian army. Give Boris Johnson the Peace Nobel Prize for that. While in the US, there are opposing views if there should be a long war in Ukraine being beefed up with ever more weapons to wear down Russia to the point of collapse, and then have a war with China in 2022 over Taiwan, which could become a world war, as a recent memorandum of General Mike Minihan suggests, or that a long war in the Ukraine would be detrimental to US interest, as discussed in a new study of the Rand Corporation, because a protracted war would absorb key resources such as manpower and money from other more important tasks, such as the coming showdown with China. While more reality-oriented military, such as the US Chief of Staff, General Mark Milley, and former General Inspector of the Bundeswehr, General Harald Kujat, strongly argue for the Ukraine war to be ended through negotiations, because the Ukrainian army would have accomplished anything they could have. The real warmongers reveal themselves, who have been the driving force behind the scenes all along. Conservative Member of Parliament and UK Defence Committee Chair is calling for a direct war between NATO and Russia. We need to face Russia directly rather than leaving Ukraine to do all the work. Former British Defence Minister Sir Gerald Howard also advertises that NATO must get boots on the ground because Ukraine must win the war. And then there are all these legions of mentally disturbed journalists who bombard the population around the clock. See, there are no red lines for the Russians. They did not use nuclear weapons after we sent howitzers, not after we sent armored personnel carriers, not after we sent Leopards and Abrams tanks. So now let's give the Ukrainians fighter jets, F-16s, yeah, and it's completely okay for them to retake Crimea, which after all is still Ukrainian territory, despite the referendum by the population there that they voted to be part of Russia. And who cares about Kosovo? It is obvious that Ukraine can't win this war, and that a continuation only means the horrible dying and suffering of the Ukrainian people. We must realize that we are still in a situation more dangerous than at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a global nuclear war could happen in the short term if there is an attempt to attack Crimea, or by accident, or even if that would be avoided, as long as global NATO, now closely allied with the EU, is trying to ruin Russia and contain the rise of China if needed by military means. Why would the rise of China have to be contained? What other crime has China committed than to lift 850 million of its citizens out of poverty and offer other countries of the Global South a development model through the BRI. Since the BRI started to become effective in overcoming underdevelopment in these countries, the security doctrines of the West started to identify Russia and China as rivals and opponents. What has the subsequent policy of accusations, sanctions, and exclusions accomplished? As Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said in his recent annual press conference, anything goes. Once revered mechanisms and institutions that were created by the US-led West have been discarded. Free market, fair competition, free enterprise, the inviolability of property, and the presumption of innocence. In a word, everything the Western globalization model relied on collapsed overnight. Sanctions have been imposed on Russia and other objectionable countries that do not comply with these tenets and mechanisms. Clearly, sanctions can be imposed on any country which in one way or another refuses to mindlessly follow American orders. It is obvious, however, that the effort to set the rules-based order, of which it is completely dubious how these rules are set, against the so-called autocracies and dictatorships, has generated a devastating blowback to the West. It is not the Russian economy which is collapsing as a result of the sanctions. It is the European and especially German economy which is threatened with deindustrialization. Rather than being drawn into the geopolitical war on the one side, on the side of the democracies, the vast majority of the Global South, the BRICS Plus, for which 17 nations have applied for membership, have refused to condemn Russia, and Brazil and Argentina refused to sell ammunition to Germany for the Leopard tank. And rather than succeeding in splitting China from Russia and its strategic partnership, the spokeswoman of the Foreign Ministry, Mao Ning, declared on January 30th in a reaction to the decision to send more heavy tanks to Ukraine, the United States is the main initiator and driving force of the Ukrainian crisis. It continuously supplies heavy and offensive weapons to Ukraine, prolonging the crisis and making it more intense. The US should stop sending weapons there and making profits from the war. The result of weaponizing the dollar by confiscating foreign assets in dollar denominations, such as 300 billion from Russia, 9 billion from Afghanistan, it is speeding up the de-dollarization of international trade and rapidly moves to set up an independent international currency. The countries of the BRICS Plus, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, and others are involved in setting up a new international currency based not only on gold, but also on oil, gas, and other hard commodities, a proposal which was issued by LaRouche in 2000. Since the economic engine of the world economy has shifted since long to Asia, and the BRICS, even without the plus, already have a higher GDP than the G7, the golden ruble 3.0 and the new currency will carry the momentum of future economic development. Hank Paulson, former US Secretary of the Treasury, in a recent article in Foreign Affairs, puts his finger on the biggest vulnerability of the present US policy of decoupling and confrontation towards China. Pointing to his own cooperation with China in the 2008 crisis, China at that time was a huge holder of corporate banking and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac securities. To avoid contagion and a complete meltdown, such a cooperation today is unthinkable. And in that light, of the much stronger position of China. China has tripled the size of its economy since 2008, has vast economic cooperation with 150 countries with the BRI, many of which have shifted their orientation, such as Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and many other countries of the global south. So what will be the outcome of the present crisis when the Anglo-Americans and NATO want Ukraine to win on the battlefield, which can only be accomplished by risking nuclear war with Russia? When Russia, for now, has given up the hope for a diplomatic solution, and it is becoming clearer and clearer that it is the de facto bankruptcy of the neoliberal financial system that is the driving force behind this desire to escalate the war. If it comes to a new, this time even deeper crisis like 2008, why on earth should the countries who are being attacked and who have an alternative cooperate with the West on saving their system? In light of the expected major offensive by Russia, bringing into play the vastly superior troop strengths, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said in Ramstein on January 20th that he sees only a short window of opportunity to turn the tide in Ukraine till the spring. The acute danger is that the undeniable efforts to pump everything into Ukraine now, more tanks, fighter jets, missiles, etc., could cross the borderline to Armageddon. Therefore, it is super urgent that all people of goodwill around the world support the initiative of Pope Francis, and that a group of countries, such as the Peace Club of President Lula and others, are putting the need for a new international security and development architecture on the international agenda before it is too late. The 10 principles on which such an architecture should be based, which I presented at a conference in November, have received significant international attention and can be the starting point for the discussion. Interestingly, the most controversial has turned out to be principle number 10, which says, the basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good and capable of infinitely perfect the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul. And being the most advanced geological force in the universe, which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and of the physical universe are in correspondence and cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome. Many people challenge the idea of an image of man where he or she is fundamentally good and all evil is due to a lack of development. It is urgent to take this interjection up because it goes to the essence of our ability to solve the crisis or not. I think philosophers and theologians of Christianity, Confucianism, Islam, or Hinduism, and other great religions and philosophies, and the great classical art will agree about the essential goodness of man and his obligation for self-perfection, lifelong learning, and development of agape. On the other hand, it is only the various forms of oligarchism that insist on the intrinsic evil in man, such as Malthus, imperialism, colonialism, racism, or fascism, which agree on the concept of man as beast man, and that there are various forms of liberalism, such as the existentialism or l'art pour l'art, which explicitly reject the need for self-improvement and preach instead the mantra of everything goes, which obviously has resulted in the present decadent collapse of the Western system. Or just read Joseph de Maistre's letter to a Russian nobleman, where he describes how man is by nature evil and therefore needs to be controlled by an oligarchical dictatorship of a nobility which has God-given privileges who oblige them to rule over the ordinary evil people, the model of oligarchy. The idea that man is by nature evil or should live as his wicked impulses dictate is an ideology which is deployed by the oligarchy, or should we say the devil, as a tool to control people and prevent them to realize their true nature as creative beings in the image of the creator. In Chinese culture, one finds essentially the same idea. These are some basic Chinese virtues and values. As heaven maintains vigor through movements, a gentleman should strive for self-perfection. A just cause should be pursued for the common good. Govern the country with virtue and educate the people with culture. A gentleman takes righteousness as his character. A man who is benevolent loves all. I believe that we have to unite as world citizens devoted to the common good of the one humanity, realizing that a tender love for humanity in order to overcome this existential crisis of our species is what is required, and rid the world of oligarchism once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. If you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's conference of the International Schiller Institute, The Age of Reason, or the Annihilation of Humanity. You've just heard Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and head of the Schiller Institute, speaking on the topic, How to Avoid Nuclear War, the Nature of Man. Our next speaker is His Excellency Donald Ramotar, former president of Guyana. And his topic is Russia, Ukraine, and its importance for the global South.
Thank you very much. It's now almost a year since the intervention of Russia into Ukraine had started. And the dangers to the world have increased tremendously since then. And the possibility of a nuclear conflict has grown larger than at any time than ever before, even if you include the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The question is why? Why has this been happening? And it is very clear that the idea from the very beginning was to try to stop Russia's ability to pose any kind of threat to the United States or to the Western world, and to destroy Russia as a country, to further divide it as the Soviet Union has been dispersed. This war has been foisted on Russia. We have said that before, and then the admission of others recently has shown that even before the war, diplomacy was used as a tool to delay and to create further conditions to put missiles on Russian border and to have NATO on its doorsteps. This, as I said, was openly admitted. The kind of deception of the Western diplomacy was openly admitted recently by Angela Merkel, and who said that they never intended to keep the agreements which they signed to guarantee the Minsk Accord that would have allowed Ukraine to continue to exist with all of its parts, including Ludansk, including Donetsk, including Crimea, would have all been part of Ukraine, and Ukraine would remain as a neutral country. However, that was not in their interest, and they used diplomacy as they use signed agreement to fool or to be deceptive and to create de facto encirclement of Russia. And this also was confirmed by Holland, the former president of France, and the former president of Ukraine. The US, of course, this showed that the US does not want cooperation or friendship on an equal footing, not only with Russia, but with any other country. But Russia is the only one with nuclear weapons that can oppose her. It remains, it wants to remain as a dominant world power and wants to destroy any powers that try to challenge her supremacy. And this is why it is important for them to try now to destroy Russia. And if you just recall, the period of hostility towards China began after the 2008 international financial and economic crisis, when China emerged as the biggest contributor to international economy and the biggest lender to developing countries and other countries, including European countries, to invest in them and so forth, that they began to see China as a competitor to its world dominance. It seems to me that the philosophy of the United States is that for its system to exist in the United States itself, it must be a world system, a dominant system throughout the world. And they're willing to enforce that by any means that is possible. Its main intention at the moment was if not immediately to defeat Russia in a quick war, to string her out, to bleed her white in a long, protracted war, as their own experience in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, and the Russian experience in Afghanistan as well. And that is what they're trying to do. And we can see too that the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia have been prepared a long time in advance, which suggests that they were sure that Russia had two choices, either to allow NATO to establish its bases in Ukraine or force Russia to respond. And they were quite sure that they have given Russia probably no chance at all. I said two possibilities, but really it was only one possibility, and in which they hoped to destroy Russia on the field. Their intention was that both military and economically, to attack from both ends to destroy her. And Russia, this over the year too, what has also become clear to all and sundry, or all who wants to know the truth, is that Russia was right all along, that it was not fighting Ukraine, but it was engaged in a battle with NATO countries who are pouring in weapons in Ukraine, and including mercenaries. After Russia destroyed the military in Ukraine, now tanks, possibly aircrafts, long-range weapons, and billions of dollars, both in weapons and assistance to Ukraine, continues to flow in that direction. And that is being done with total disregard for the socio-economic problems in many of those countries that have become major donors to Ukraine. Another reason for this escalation lies also another reason that this escalation is becoming more and more dangerous is for us to recall that the reason for Russian intervention was, one, to prevent the NATO expansion, and two, to defend the Russian communities that lived for centuries in the Ukraine, communities that were harassed and bombed every day, every single day that they have been attacked and constantly bombed, while they were hoping for some type of agreement and settlement, and a settlement that they hoped that the Minsk Accord would have allowed them to do. So that condition had, those two conditions have not been met. In fact, it has become worse now in both areas. Russia's security is still a threat. Russia continues to be in the line of fire of the sophisticated weapons that are being given to Ukraine. And that has been given to Ukraine in the first place and continues to pour into Ukraine at this point in time. The other reason is that Russia has not collapsed as an economic, its economy did not collapse. In fact, European economies are the ones that are suffering more from this. But there is now a complete colonialization of Europe that has taken place by the United States against the European Union, because clearly the European Union is acting not in its own best interests, and to guarantee that they keep that colonial kind of domination even further on the European Union, they have destroyed one of the main economic links that Russia has with the European Union, the two pipelines, the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines that was supplying gas to Europe. And all of these things have been done, and the Europeans, while they're from time to time, we see dissatisfaction in some areas, but generally they seem to be incapable of doing anything about it. And I suppose the Americans are doing precisely as they please, because their attitude to Europe was very well expressed by Newland about where the European can go. And what has happened, one of the unintended consequences that has developed, that is also creating a big scare in the US and among NATO countries, is the fact that many countries are more or less agreeing that there needs to be a change in the international economic relations that exist. The dominance of the dollar is now for the first time being challenged, as a lot of countries are following the pattern of of Russia in trading within their own currencies and trading so that the relevance of the dollar could become less importance. And this is an extremely important challenge to the dominance of the United States itself, because there's a possibility that China's yen can become a more important currency on the international scene, and also the possibility of a new currency taking shape. And many countries are ready to cooperate in that regard, largely because they find that the sanctions that are imposed by the United States like a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. And therefore, they want to have some more freedom of actions and some more freedom of association. But then can you imagine what will happen if a strong currency emerges in which many, many countries can follow and be part of. Right now, the debt in the United States is but 1.5 times the GDP. That in our country, if that happens, or any other country, if that happens, or countries where we don't have a strong currency to trade by, if that happens, it's a huge economic crisis that will cause great dislocation in every aspect of the society. If the dollar becomes less important in international trade, it is a major, major challenge to this system, the imperialist system of domination that exists. And that too is scaring the United States, it's scaring a lot of the ruling class in these countries that see the importance of their own existence tied to the system being the dominant system in the world. I would like also to point out to the fact that since this has been going on just nearly a year now, many of the masks of democracy and human rights is being ripped off the face of the so-called Western democracies. The freedom of the press.
Yes, President Ramotar. He's frozen.
Which is regarded a democratic society system and included as part of a system of human rights.
President Ramotar.
We see.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yes, we're running into time constraints. Could you summarize?
Yes. Okay. Well, I would say the important things now to have one of the important things that we need to do is to broaden this opposition to the war. And we in the southern part of the world who will also be destroyed if a nuclear war ever happens. It means therefore that we too should have a place in the table. And that is why it is very welcome, the initiative being taken now by President Lula in Brazil, so that we can get involved and have a say and have a voice into this matter to create some organization where our voices could be heard. Secondly, the proposal that was proposed by Helga on the linking peace and with development and ending of poverty, I think that is extremely important to put back onto the agenda and to be discussed more fully. I think it's essentially correct, and it needs to be fine-tuned and to ensure that is on the agenda. And thirdly, I believe that we should try to advocate more and more people to sign this letter to the Pope that some of us have signed already, to get the church has taken an admirable position, and we should give it solidarity and support to the initiative that they have been taking in order to bring this war to an end and to eventually to save our world. Thank you for your attention, and I apologize if I went over my time a little bit.
Well, thank you very much, President Ramotar, and don't worry about the time. We'll have time for questions and discussion a bit later. If you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's International Schiller Institute Conference, The Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. You've just heard His Excellency Donald Ramotar, former president of Guyana. Our next speaker is Ray McGovern of the United States, former senior analyst with the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and the founding member of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. His topic is, and some of you know where this comes from, others don't, know where you stand and stand there. Ray, happy to see you. Oh, you got to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're very clear.
Good. Well, thank you, Dennis. I'm very happy to be with you. The title of my little talk here, Know Where You Stand and Stand There, comes from a commencement address by my friend and tutor and mentor, Father Dan Berrigan. Actually, it doesn't come from that commencement address. It is the sum and total of his commencement address. He was asked by a very prestigious university to come and give the commencement addresses about 4 decades ago. And he came and he stood up there and he said those words, "Know where you stand and stand there." And then he very politely left and sat down with the audience. That's all you really need to know, folks. You need to know where you stand and stand there. Now, sometimes we're a little worried, nonviolence is good, but sometimes when we put ourselves in other people's faces and they react with a very great anger, we too are tempted to get angry, not only at their reaction, but at the whole concept of the widespread injustice throughout the world. And so I would just encourage us all to remember that anger is a virtue. None other than Thomas Aquinas said so. He said, anger is a virtue, but you have to have just so much of it. He warned against too much anger, iracundia, always being ticked off. That was the Latin word, okay? But he also warned about unreasoned patience. That's the best we could do from the Latin, okay? He said, unreasoned patience sows the seeds of vice, nourishes negligence, and encourages good people to tolerate bad people, or the bad things that people do. I don't really think there are bad people. And so what we need to do here is figure out how to act nonviolently and with just the right dosage of the virtue of anger. Now, I'm not the greatest representative of what is now called by Jose Vega and others interventions. Yeah, interventions in the same sense of the word. People are pretty crazy in Washington. But I'll give you some personal examples of how I tried to stand up and do what Dan Berrigan suggested. May we have the first slide, please? Okay, this is a photo of me standing up, turning my back to Hillary Clinton, who you can see off my left shoulder. And she was talking about repression in Iran. And suffice to say, there was great repression exercised on me simply for standing up, not saying a word, non-violently again, but angry. And I was beat up pretty bad, but I didn't even have to stay in jail that night. I got to go home. I had to go to the hospital first. And interestingly enough, the doctor said, "Now, you were beaten up. You have to report this to the authorities." I said, to State Department of Security? They did it. Okay. So that was number one. Maybe we have the second slide, please. Okay, here I wasn't so lucky. I did have to spend the night in jail. That's okay. Good things happen in jail. You get to feel what other people feel, being all closed up and unfree. Now, what are the lessons here? Well, this particular photo was taken after I stood up and intervened, so to speak, with the Senate Intelligence Committee before they approved the nomination of Torturer-in-Chief Gina Haspel to be the new CIA director 5 or 6 years ago. What encouraged me to do that? Well, just the obscenity of the whole thing. I mean, hello. So what do you do in situations like that? Well, number one, you kind of, as you can see, you blend in with the indigenous to get in, right? You put your best wedding suit on, which I had, okay? Number two, you stay away from known interveners. Code Pink, for example. You let them sit over in the court. You go separately, okay? Number three, you hope that one of those code pickers has a camera, and indeed one did. Therefore, this picture, after they had taken me out of the hearing room, and what I have is number four here. I was just thinking today. People have been asking me, "What's this green band you have on there, Ray?" Let me read it to you. Rachel Corrie, April 10, 1979, March 16, 2003. Suffice it to say that if 23-year-old Rachel Corrie can stand up to Israeli bulldozers about to demolish yet another Palestinian home, and then that Israeli bulldozer being instructed to back up over Rachel to make sure that her back was broken 3 days before the attack on Iraq, so it would not make the headlines. Well, if Rachel Corrie could do that, McGovern, you can do that too. At least you're not going to get run over, yet at least, by an Israeli bulldozer. So we Catholics call this a sacramental. Something that reminds you of a grace-giving event or a grace-giving thing or a grace-giving person like Rachel Corrie. Her dad gave me this bracelet 3 months after she was killed. I want to also suggest that those of you who are interested in taking some action, go to all the think tank presentations, as Jose Vega has started to do. Here's one that I'd like to show you. There's a little clip of a event at John Podesta and Hillary Clinton's old think tank. I went to all those things as long as I lived in Washington. And sometimes I got to ask questions. They were never welcome. This time they didn't recognize me. They didn't let me ask a question, but I hung around, you might say. Nevertheless, I persisted. So I went up to this Adam Schiff, then head of the House Intelligence Committee, and I asked him about Russian hacking, which now has been conclusively disproven. Now, could we show this 2-minute clip? If you fall asleep, you'll miss the whole thing. May we have that 2-minute clip?
Chief, my name is Ray McGovern. I served in CIA under 7 presidents and 9 directors.
Well, thank you very much.
We have a little alumni group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and we've been following this issue very closely. One of our members is the former technical director of NSA. I'm interested in 1 week ago, when the president said this, I don't want to misquote him, the conclusions of the intelligence community with respect to Russian hacking were not conclusive regarding WikiLeaks. In other words, there's a big gap between alleged Russian hacking and WikiLeaks. The intelligence community does not know how or if that information, to the degree it exists, got to WikiLeaks. Now, you assert as flat fact that Russia did this. Do you know more than Obama?
I would never claim to know more than Obama. I think he's a brilliant man.
It's a very serious question.
No, it's a serious question. I have every confidence in the intelligence of the Russian hacking of both the DNC as well as John Podesta.
James Clapper is a convicted...
You asked me a question. Do you want to hear the answer?
I will.
While I can't go into the classified information, I have every confidence that the Russians views WikiLeaks, whether Julian Assange was a knowing participant or, as the Russians would describe, a useful idiot. That we will hopefully find out. But I don't have any question in the conclusions that the intelligence
You have every confidence but no evidence. Is that right?
No, I can't share the evidence with you.
Yeah.
Congressman?
I'm
Paul
that's
Joy.
bogus.
I'm former
That's bogus.
Director of Security Senate Intelligence Committee. We always refer to it as the SSCI, the Intelligence.
Well, I have to concede now, after all these years, that Schiff said one thing that was true, and that is that he couldn't share that information with me because it didn't exist. Now, what's the lesson here? I just want to encourage everyone, go to these meetings, go to these think tanks, and nevertheless persist. I didn't know the camera was still on. I didn't know that C-SPAN still had audio, but I did it, and I'm glad because that was captured. Now, what else? I'm going to read in conclusion a poem written by my mentor, Dan Berrigan, a quote from whom we started this little talk. It's called Some. I don't want to spoil it for you. It's not very long, but I do want to have a photo up as backdrop. Could we have that slide number 4, please? Some stood up once and sat down. Some walked a mile and walked away. Some stood up twice, then sat down. I've had it, they said. Some walked 2 miles, then walked away. It's too much, they cried. Some stood and stood and stood. They were taken for fools. They were taken for having been taken in. Some walked and walked and walked. They walked the earth. They walked the skies. They walked the waters. Why do you stand? They were asked, and why do you walk? Because of the children. Because of the children, they said, and because of the heart, because of the bread, because the cause is the heart's beat, and the children born, and the risen bread. You're looking at a little boy, 2 years old, the age of our youngest of 10 grandchildren, who was trying to escape the oppression, the war in Syria. He was of Kurdish origin, the stepchildren of all wars. And suffice it to say, he drowned with his big brother and his mother trying to get to Greece. Alan Kurdi is his name. Because of the children, they said. So, nevertheless, we must persist because of the children. And we must look for moral leadership, but absent moral leadership, we're it. There's no other but us. Now we can appeal, for example, I have appealed to Pope Francis, and that's appeared on the largest religious network run by Catholics. It's just up. You can see it on my website, raymcgovern.com. But we can't wait. We can't wait for a voice from the Vatican. We have to do what we can ourselves. And that's why I applaud and I welcome the chance to be on every Schiller conference to which I'm invited. And I applaud all of us, and particularly Helga, for exercising moral leadership at this critical point in time. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Ray. For those of you who have just joined us, you've just heard Ray McGovern, former intelligence specialist with the CIA. He just spoke on the topic, know where you stand and stand there. We certainly know where Ray stands. Our next presentation is by Jack Gilroy, organizer for Pax Christi from New York State, also the Pax Christi International as well, and a board member of New York Veterans for Peace. He is speaking in support of Pope Francis's initiative for peace.
This is Jack Gilroy of International Pax Christi, New York State Pax Christi, USA Pax Christi. And we're here really to thank Pope Francis for his courageous and generous outreach of moral and religious leadership to call for an end to the war in the Ukraine. He notes that more weapons are not going to end the war, and we agree, because more weapons to us means putting more gasoline on an existing fire. Francis is now joined by the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, in urging that many nations, he's asking for as many as 20 nations to come together for a conference to call for negotiations. So we urge all nonviolent people everywhere to find ways to express the need for negotiations. We, of course, also say that responsible people like the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists are people to listen to. They've been around since shortly after World War II, but they have never put the big hand of the doomsday clock as close to midnight as it is right now. We urge religious leaders to join Pope Francis and political leaders to join President da Silva of Brazil in the demand for sanity. Religion or non-religion, we need to stand as one human race in opposition to the war. Organize and act as sisters and brothers for peace and for justice. We have to be nonviolent. We have to work in solidarity.
Thank you, Jack. And if you've just joined us, welcome to today's Schiller Institute conference, The Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. Next, we're going to hear from Ambassador Chas Freeman. This is actually, and he is the former ambassador to Saudi Arabia and former deputy chief of missions to China. This is an excerpt from a longer interview that was conducted by Schiller Institute organizer Mike Billington. And the topic is grouped as "We Must Change America to Avert War."
The military impact will be minimal in the short term because the tanks are not going to be there. It will take months to familiarize Ukrainian soldiers with how to operate these tanks and, more important, how to maintain them. Tanks have a nasty habit of breaking down quite frequently and requiring repairs on the spot. It's not clear to what extent Ukrainians will be able to master these particular tanks as opposed to the ones they're familiar with. Down the road, tanks, of course, are offensive instruments. They are effective at breaking through enemy lines and allowing infantry to advance behind them. They are not generally thought of as defensive. So they tie into the Ukrainian idea of some sort of counteroffensive against Russian holdings in Ukraine. On the other hand, by the time they get there, the situation on the battlefield is likely to be quite different. We're on the eve of what appears to be a major Russian push against the Ukrainians, both in the east and in the south. And the ground has frozen in the south, allowing heavy vehicles and tanks to advance through what would otherwise be pretty impenetrable mud. As far as the appearance of German tanks in Ukraine is concerned, I think you can see that from several perspectives. It obviously will evoke all sorts of nasty memories in Russia of the last time German tanks appeared on Russia's borders. But aside from that, it represents an an important further evidence of German abandonment of the pacifism that was imposed on it by World War II. This makes Germany a co-belligerent in the war. And it was something that the German government was obviously very reluctant to do, understanding the importance of it, and the fact that a remilitarized Germany will be of concern not just to the Russians, but to many other Europeans, given memories of the past. So this is an important political moment, one that has major implications for European security, and it's not clear where we are headed with this. China's been very careful to stay out of the regional quarrels that trouble the Middle East. It is clearly rhetorically on the side of the Palestinians, for example, but it maintains cordial relations with the government of Israel. It has a very productive working relationship with Iran, but it also has similar relationships with the Gulf Arab states across the Persian Gulf. So China's policy resembles that of the United States shortly after our establishment as an independent country. It seeks friendship and commerce with all and entangling alliances with none. This is a policy that worked very well for us throughout the 19th century, and it's working out quite well for China. I don't think the Middle East is being much changed by China, or that China indeed has much aspiration to change the Middle East. Its demands on Middle Eastern governments are minimal. It has nothing to say about how they organize their domestic politics or societies. All it asks is that they not challenge China's one China policy as it applies to Taiwan. Beyond that, China is open for business and trying to generate business. The one area where there may be some major difference looming is in the area of military industries. Many countries in the Middle East, not just Israel, which has a very substantial high-tech military industrial sector, are trying to build their own military industries to reduce dependence on foreign imports, having had the experience of seeing foreign suppliers embargo exports or suspend them in ways that were injurious to their security as they conceived it. And the Chinese, I think, are going to be more willing than Western countries have been to share technology in the new in military industries in countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE and so forth. So to that extent, China will make a difference in the region. Otherwise, China's perfectly happy to have people in the region continue to be what they are. You know, I believe that democracy in many respects is a very good system and a desirable one. But if people in other countries don't agree with me, that is their prerogative. And I think the Chinese deserve respect for doing what President Kennedy once advocated, and that is trying to make the world safe for diversity.
That was Ambassador Chas Freeman of the United States, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia and former deputy chief of mission to China. And if you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's Schiller Institute conference, The Age of Reason, or the Annihilation of Humanity. Our next presentation is by Dr. Wolfgang Bittner of Germany. He is a jurist and author, and today he is speaking on the topic, We Are in War Mode.
Wir sind jetzt seit mehreren Monaten
seit mehreren Monaten im Kriegsmodus.
when Joseph Biden spoke on the need for Vladimir Putin to respect Ukraine's sovereignty or Russia would face increasing consequences, the US prepared coup d'etat in Kiev in defiance of Ukraine's sovereignty had already taken place, and the civil war in eastern Ukraine had already begun. Shortly thereafter, US President Barack Obama forced European leaders to impose tough sanctions on Russia. This was the beginning of a deliberate confrontation into which Germany and the European Union were increasingly drawn in. Long forgotten is Russian President Vladimir Putin's offer of cooperation in 2001, when he promoted in his historical speech in the German Bundestag, promoted a common economic space from Vladivostok to Lisbon. The US prevented that from happening. After the coup they instigated, they took over Ukraine in a cold way, creating a flashpoint on Russia's doorstep that they kept stoking. The Minsk agreement was ignored by Kiev. Russia's legitimate demands for security guarantees were unanswered, and in mid-February 2022, attacks on Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic escalated. As a result, Russian troops invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, and the result was an outcry from the so-called value-based West with a gigantic war propaganda accompanied by extensive arms deliveries to Ukraine. The US and NATO, with the help of the instrumentalized Ukraine, began to wage a covert war against Russia. Meanwhile, the doomsday clock shows 90 seconds to midnight. Nevertheless, submissive, ideologized politicians in the European Union follow the dictates from Washington to the detriment of their own countries. Both Germany, as the supposed leading European power, as well as the EU with Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who came to power as a result of manipulations, are contributing to the aggravation of the situation and are thus constantly overstepping their authority by betraying their primary mandate of preserving peace and security. To put it more bluntly, the German government and the EU Commission are abusing their mandate. Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned the West several times against arming Ukraine with offensive weapons, and he offered negotiations. His statements that Moscow was interested in cooperation with all foreign partners, despite the Western policies of aggression, were dismissed as propaganda. The efforts of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who had warned of a highly dangerous expansion of the Ukraine war, also came to nothing. Lavrov had already spoken weeks ago of a hybrid war against Russia aimed at ruining the country and bringing about a political coup d'etat. It is clear that the Western alliance led by the United States intends to defeat Russia with all available means. What has been brewing in this constellation between Germany and Russia is a tragedy and a disaster for the century. It is particularly tragic that Germany is allowing itself to be positioned against Russia for the third time. This was the case in the First World War, in the Second World War, and is the case again right now. Germany's unconditional surrender in 1945 put it completely in the hands of the US, which for more than 100 years has pursued a long-term strategy aimed at primarily at preventing cooperation between Germany and Russia as an economic and military rival. Now Germany is used as a spearhead against Russia. Japan and South Korea are directed against China. The US want to assert with all its power its claim of global domination, which is not justified by anything, even if it comes to a major war in the process. This hubris emanates from the neoconservatives in Washington, with the financial and economic elites there and their figurehead, Joseph Biden, who has shared responsibility for almost all the conflicts and wars of recent decades. He is also the one who obliges Germany to unconditionally support Ukraine to participate in a war of attrition from which the US profits extraordinarily economically and financially. A renewed escalation in Russia's relations with the Western allies has occurred following a startling statement by former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. In a December 2022 interview, she said that the Minsk Agreement of 2014 was concluded by the West to give Ukraine time to grow stronger. French President Macron and Ukrainian ex-President Poroshenko have confirmed this. According to them, war with Russia was the intention from the beginning that the West pursued in and with Ukraine. What comes to light is a monstrosity. The governments of Germany, France, Ukraine, and the United States double-crossed each other in the leading up to the Russian invasion, i.e. they intrigued, lied, and made preparations for war. Russian President Vladimir Putin expressed deep disappointment. He deplored a lack of honesty and questions whether there was anyone left to come to an agreement with and what guarantees he could rely on. After these revelations, he said trust was almost at zero, but he added ultimately an agreement had to be reached and Russia was ready and open to it. Instead of responding to this, there was a veritable witch hunt against the Berlin government to deliver Leopard battle tanks, i.e. heavy offensive weapons, to Ukraine, which has now happened. Now, Ukrainian strongman Volodymyr Zelensky is demanding fighter jets and long-range missiles. That the delivery of such weapons can only aggravate the situation in Ukraine has been proven in recent weeks. The more supplies the West delivers, the longer this confrontation will last. Ukraine will perish in the process, but Germany, which constantly sends weapons and pays billions to Kiev, will be ruined too. The fact that a large part of the German population wants peace with Russia is disregarded by its own government because of the pressure from Washington and some of its vassal states. Zelensky can insult and abuse the German government, but Olaf Scholz and Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock continue to assure him their unlimited support. Many wonder how Berlin politicians come to make such promises and why Germany would owe Ukraine anything at all. A paradigm shift in the assessment of the Ukraine war on the Western side was recently initiated by the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, when he called for negotiations with Russia, contrary to Joseph Biden's policy, in an interview in the New York Times. Apparently, senior military officials in the US and Europe now fear the incompetence of politicians such as Biden, Austin, Zelensky, Baerbock, and are beginning to speak out. This doesn't seem to bother US President Joseph Biden at all. He believes he has reached the goal of his decade-long efforts to ruin Russia and subject it to Western desires as well as strategic interests. But the Russian government will preempt that. Russia will have no choice but to prevail in this confrontation, despite the immense arms supplies of the Western alliance. Anything else will not work. Russia is a nuclear power and will never allow a defeat that would involve dismemberment of the country. Apart from the acute nuclear threat, the consequences of the US-provoked confrontation are grave. Russia has long since begun to disengage from the West, to forge new paths with new partners, and to resist US aggression policies. Russia is not alone in this. More than half of humanity no longer wants to put up with the impositions and oppression of the United States. We have to note that the BRICS organization and the Shanghai Cooperative are becoming more and more popular. They are working on a different economic and financial system than the Western one dominated by the United States. Among other things, the domination of the dollar as the world reserve currency is being called in question, which, however, entails further highly dangerous disputes because the United States will not allow itself to be driven into bankruptcy without resistance. It has the world's greatest military power, and this must be taken into account in all future efforts to create a more peaceful world. At present, two nuclear powers are facing each other in a proxy war that could escalate any minute. And this shall be avoided, hopefully.
Thank you, Dr. Bittner. And if you just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's International Schiller Institute Conference, The Age of Reason or the Annihilation of Humanity. You've just heard from Dr. Wolfgang Bittner, a jurist and author who spoke on the topic, We Are in War Mode. And next, what we're doing is we're going to present a dialogue among three Americans. This was Diane Sare, candidate for United States Senate in New York, Nick Brana, the national chair of the People's Party, and Angela McArdle, the chair of the Libertarian National Committee. And the topic is, can Americans put aside their divisions to stop nuclear war?
Great, thank you very much. And I am here with two very important guests to discuss the resistance in the United States and what we're building internationally to prevent a thermonuclear war, which is the first step to moving mankind into a new paradigm. So I'd like to introduce Angela McArdle, who is the chair of the Libertarian Party National Committee, and Nick Brana, who is the national chair of the People's Party. And we will be discussing an upcoming action on February 19th. What I would like to do now is just present the strategic context for this rally. So, first of all, I think part of the problem that we're facing in the United States is the delusion. There's a delusional arrogance that we have to lay to rest. Not that a lot of people are not concerned about thermonuclear war, not that many Americans, maybe most Americans, are not suffering the effects of hyperinflation, the difficulty in just making ends meet. But I think people don't fully realize the difference between our nation, which we have been accustomed to thinking of as the best at everything in the world, the famous American exceptionalism. When we defeated the British Empire, that was exceptional. We were the first nation to defeat the biggest empire ever to exist on the planet. And the purpose of that was not so that we could replicate the crimes of that empire, but so that we could create a model of self-government that allowed the maximum potential development of each individual's talents, and not arbitrary talents, but talents that would contribute to the immortality of mankind, that would contribute to the greater good of humanity as a whole, which requires freedom, because it's there where your creativity is unleashed. Unfortunately, we very much lost our way, and I wanted to share some insights that I was really struck by in an interview I heard 2 days ago that was done by former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter with the notorious Russian arms trafficker, as he was labeled in the American press, Viktor Bout, who served 14 years and 9 months in American prisons. And he reported on some things which I just thought would be of interest for Americans to know. One thing that Scott Ritter asked him is, what was it like returning to Moscow? And what Mr. Bout said is that he couldn't believe how beautiful and modern the city was. The streets were clean. Everything was lit up. The stores were well stocked. And he described the situation of the Russian population now, as it's become very clear to everyone that the West lied, that the West was worse than people expected, that Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, and now even Boris Johnson have all admitted that the Minsk Accords were merely a fraud to buy time, to arm, to prepare for war with Russia. The illusion is off. The only opposition to what President Putin is doing is that people wish he would be more aggressive. But otherwise, the country is quite unified. It's very different. Compare that and think about that in the United States. Can you say that New York City is clean, infested with rats, with potholes that your car can fall into? Our nation, as Bout described it, he said the United States is flooded with drugs, and what does that indicate in terms of your care for the younger generation? Our young people, our children, are seen as sex objects for profit, not as potential creators for the future. And in fact, the other thing that Mr. Bout described is he said the other prisoners were asking him if they could emigrate to Russia. They're so upset about the conditions in the United States, the lack of a future, the insanity, the breakdown, that they would prefer to live somewhere else where you don't have this insanity. So I thought that was, in fact, a very useful perspective for Americans to reflect that what we are living in, the shape of our cities, the mass shootings, the mass insanity, which reflect a demoralization of the population, is not necessary. We don't have to live this way. We could be planning to build 6 or 7 modern new cities in all of that empty land in the western part of the United States, Or maybe even we should do something like the Chinese have done, build a new city somewhere a little ways outside of Manhattan, move everybody out so we can repair the infrastructure and move them back in. We don't think this way anymore. Instead of sending $112 billion to the most corrupt nation in Europe, Ukraine, for weapons which are flowing into ISIS, neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine committing hideous atrocities, or Boko Haram, perhaps we should be investing that money in building modern infrastructure in the United States to bring the United States into league with the BRICS nations, which, as I was just reading, now control BRICS Plus, now produce over 70% of the world's coal, over 70% of the world's steel, over 53% of the world's wheat. That's the reality of the planet. So in order to get to this new paradigm, there are two steps. One is emphatically stopping the war drive. And I would say there are two things to consider. One is that 2/3 of the world's population vehemently opposes having war with Russia or China. You see the difficulty that Tony Blinken is having in lining up nations to join our unholy alliance. Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina have all announced they are not going to send weapons to Ukraine. Brazil just said they're not going to send ammunition to Germany because they don't want Germany to send it to Ukraine. So most of the world is opposed to this action. In the United States, what I think we would find if we polled people is that the overwhelming majority of Americans do not think a nuclear war with Russia is a good idea. They don't think we should be arming Ukraine, that there has to be a way to get off of this. But how would that be visualized? How can we make that known? How do we get through to our elected officials? And to answer that question, I'm going to bring on our guests who have teamed up to organize a very, very important action, what should become a world historic action in Washington, D.C. on February 19th, President's Day weekend of this year. So I will stop there and allow you, I guess, Nick, if you want to go ahead and tell people what this is about.
I'd be glad to start. So I want to thank you, Diane, the Schiller Institute, for helping the host promote the action, Rage Against the War Machine, and you, Diane, also for speaking at the event. Great to have you. And so, as you've talked about, and as the Schiller Institute has been a leader in talking about, we are on the cusp of nuclear war as a result of NATO aggression, U.S. aggression, and an empire that is falling apart and going the way of so many empires before in a militaristic fury. The difference is that this time, unlike the world wars, unlike any kind of wars in the past, we have nuclear weapons and we have the power to annihilate ourselves. And so on February 19th, we are going to be going to the Lincoln Memorial, People's Party, the Libertarian Party, along with Action for Assange, many other different organizations, World Beyond War, that are helping to put this on. And we are going to rally at the Lincoln Memorial and demand an end to the billions going to Ukraine, demand an end to this war, an end to the war machine itself, the abolition of NATO, the CIA, the abolition of all of these appendages of war. And we are then going to be marching to the White House to deliver our demands to that demented warmonger, Joe Biden. And then after that, we're going to have a reception. We are going to have a film screening of Revealing Ukraine, produced by Oliver Stone. We're very excited for that as well. A couple days later, we are going to have actions in Congress directly, a sit-in. And so it's becoming a whole weekend of opposition of war. And I'm also very excited to say that we have sister rallies coming up all over the place, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in other places in the U.S., and internationally, which you were just telling us about, Diane. So very excited about that. There's the No to NATO March, which is partnered with us as well. That is in London on the 25th. And so this is really growing. A rebellion within NATO is growing against the forces of annihilation, against the forces of war, and saying that instead we need to build a world of peace to replace this war machine that is going to kill us sooner or later.
Thank you. Angela.
I want to talk about how important it is and meaningful it is that we have performed, we've put everything together through the lens of an issue coalition. A lot of people have come together from different political ideologies and different backgrounds to support this action, because this issue really transcends political boundaries. Our coalition spans a lot of different political parties and ideologies, because we're all, no matter where we come from, we all feel compelled to speak out against this war on behalf of humanity, because nuclear war affects everyone. Peace is for everyone. And even though we might all have a different idea about economics or how we want to get to wherever we're going, from a values perspective, we all want a future world that is free of nuclear war. We want a safe, prosperous future for our family, for our friends, and for the people who come after us. We don't want to live in the shadow of nuclear winter. We want to see humanity thrive. And that's why we've been able to set aside some of our other differences and come together. And quite honestly, it's been a wonderful experience. I think that we need to have things like this happen a lot more often, because it really helps us to kind of push past the tribalism that holds us back in so many ways. It's just so unnecessary, where we can really connect with people on a values-based level and understand, like, we're all part of humanity. We all want to move forward. We want what's best for everyone. And believe it or not, there are a lot of areas that we all agree on. So this is one of them. And it's pretty stark what we're up against, right? Like, this is no joke. We are dealing with NATO. We're dealing with some international alliances that are incredibly powerful, with a lot of money and political power behind them. But I'd like to think that there are more of us than there are of them. So I'm excited about this event. I want to invite as many people as possible to join us. If you oppose war, you are welcome and you belong here.
Great. Thank you very much. I think you may want to say a little more about the tribalism question, because people outside the United States might not quite realize how that works. And I would ask both of you for your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I'd say that the Libertarian Party is very much about free markets and individualism. That's our focus. We have a lot of agreements with the People's Party and some of our other sponsors, but we don't necessarily agree on economics or regulatory frameworks or even other particular issues of governance. And I'll let Nick, speak for his own. I'll let him be the best representative for his organization. But maybe some of this stuff doesn't make it into mainstream news. I'm sure that some of the fighting between Republicans and Democrats does, though. And you'll see that they're actually pretty quiet on this issue. They seem to be pretty much in unison on support of arming Ukraine and NATO and going to war. But us, people from the independent sector and from minor parties, like, we're in agreement on not going to war, and we have set aside like a lot of differences. Like, we'll run candidates maybe against each other, like the Green Party, for example. Like, they're definitely not ideologically the same as the Libertarian Party, but I'd like to think almost all of us are very adamant about opposing this action.
I would agree with what Angela said. I'm very proud that we've been able to come together as, a party perceived as being on the right, the Libertarian Party, party perceived as being on the left, the People's Party, and show that issues of ending war, ending militarism, ending empire, abolishing NATO, the CIA, the deep state, all of that is not a left-right issue. As the People's Party, we really see that framework, the left-right framework, as an outdated framework that is used as part of the ideological control matrix to keep people from actually talking to each other. As Jimmy Dore, who's going to be a speaker, says, it's meant to make you hate and distrust your neighbor. Because then, as long as you're suspicious of each other, as long as you are hateful towards each other, then you're never going to actually look up at who's making the money from the war? Who's really profiting? The military industrial complex, all the private contractors, Raytheon, Boeing, and then the kickbacks that they send straight back to the members of Congress, FTX, all the money that they're making as well, top of the campaign contributions, the gifts they give them. They're the only ones profiting. We're the ones who are suffering the loss in civil liberties that are justified in the name of war. We're the ones who are suffering the billions of dollars that are being sent over there, or our taxpayer money that could be doing a hell of a lot of good here, where there are hundreds of thousands of people who are homeless, millions who don't have health care, as we see as the People's Party. And so that's what we see. But despite those differences on economics, some aspects of government, we are very proud that we can come together on those things that we do agree on, because this is really normative. In most of the world, there are which has a multi-party system. The United States has a two-party system, Democrats and Republicans, both completely owned by Wall Street and the war machine, And so here, as two independent parties, the People's Party and the Libertarian Party, really our perspectives are completely shut out. But in other countries where there are multi-party systems, it's common for parties that have differences in other areas to collaborate on issues where they agree. That's how you build coalitions. Of course, here in the United States, which is the heart of the world empire and the global financial, economic, military hegemony, they can't have people seeing through those ideological differences. So they had to construct a particularly isolating and atomizing social and economic system that is meant to keep us all apart, separated, and from seeing our common interests. That really, this is now a fight between a few people who are enriching themselves at our expense on issue after issue, especially the military-industrial complex, the endless wars, the war in Ukraine, and everybody else. Everybody else has a whole hell of a lot more in common than those few elites who are making all of the money, all the profit, endangering everybody's lives with a nuclear war.
Yeah.
Great. So we'll just conclude here, but we will be available for the discussion period. I would like to encourage people to actually write to questions@schillerinstitute.org if you can organize a sister rally and want to be involved in this, because I know we have listeners from around the world. And I would just like to say in conclusion of our remarks that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has put forward a document on 10 principles. This is very important because principles are unifying. Picky little details can be dividing. The first principle is the question of agreements among sovereign nations, that the sovereignty of each nation must be respected equally as we respect the sovereignty of individuals. You don't force people to do things, but you act through reason. The final of the principles is that mankind is essentially good, and I found that that one tends to be the most controversial, but I would say that you can see that it is true because, frankly, Americans are not happy with the way things are going, which means that there is something internal already there, which recognizes that it is wrong for human beings to suffer as they are. And that conscience that exists in all of us, some people have worked very hard to suppress it and crush it and be nasty and perpetrate evil, but it's there. And that's what we must have faith in, and also know that it's our responsibility to ensure that that goodness of humanity is allowed to come forward. So thank you very much, and we'll be participating in the discussion at the end of this panel.
That was Diane Sare, Nick Brana, and Angela McArdle, and we'll be hearing from them a little later. We have now a group of clergy from America. Their topic, "We are obligated to speak and act for peace. American clergy support the Pope's initiative for negotiations without preconditions to prevent World War III." We're hearing from Pastor Robert Smith of Michigan, Reverend Kinzer Pointer of Buffalo, and Dr. Ernest Johnson of Louisiana.
Hi, I'm Robert Smith Jr. I'm very fortunate to be the pastor of the New Bethel Baptist Church of Detroit, Michigan. It was a church where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made his I Have a Dream speech for the first time. The pastor is C.L. Franklin, who has done many, many great things for world peace, for civil rights, and particularly for just bringing men together in love. However, he's so well known for his thermonuclear voice and the voice of his daughter, Aretha Franklin, that many of the great things about the church are never mentioned. It is a historical church, has received the historical marker around the changes it made in Detroit. Reverend Franklin having the Pan-African movement there in October of 1969. It changed everything in Detroit over the next 10 years. Many Blacks will be elected to judgeship, to council seats, and even to the seat of the mayor and the congressman. Our church, when the Persian Gulf War broke out, great attack under Bush 1, held a worldwide call for peace. We had all of the national media there and our mayor there and others, and we cried out that what was needed in Detroit was jobs, was homes. What was needed in Detroit was decent education facilities. But what was not needed was to take the human resources out and send them across the world to kill other brown people. We are saddened by this war, and we're also frightened because this is different from most things going on, because this is what you might call white on white, and that leads to world war. There are wars going on all the time, all over Africa. Some 92 conflicts are going on at any one given time, but that's black on black. It's different when it's white on brown or white on black, but for a white on white war to go too long, it causes massive destruction, as with World War I and World War II. Our fear is that we're headed that way again. I'm also the chairman of what the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated called Foreign Mission. I call it Global Mission because in Christ there are no foreigners. Jesus said, ultimately, I call you friend. And until we get the same attitude that the Pope has about this war, about all this unnecessary killing, about the exploitation of Africa that has gone on forever. Yes, the same ingredient in the crumb is in the cake, but it's time for Africans to get something more than the crumbs. They need a slice of the cake, or at least one whole cake. So we're asking you to help us make a worldwide cry. It is not enough for the Pope, and we thank God for him and the cry that he is making concerning Africa, concerning nuclear war. But we need every leader, Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Pentecostal. The church is the salt of the earth. That means draw out corruption. It's the light of the world. That means show the way. And I'm afraid we have stood back too long. Yes, it is. It is dangerous to take the stand when you affect monies. When you affect money, usually blood flows. Martin died at an early age. Jesus died at an early age. Malcolm X died at an early age. But we must risk our lives to make a better world for our children and our children's children. We pray that you would join in and be a part of the call for the end of sending billions of dollars to kill other people. Let's spend billions of dollars to house the homeless, to clothe the naked. Let's spend billions of dollars to feed the hungry. God bless you.
My brothers and sisters, good day. I'm Pastor Kaiser M. Pointer, pastor of Liberty Missionary Baptist Church in the city of Buffalo. I'm coming before you today because I want to speak to you. Actually, using the words of that great 20th century social activist, Martin Luther King Jr. Why today? Because 45 years ago, from the pulpit of the Riverside Church in Lower Manhattan, Martin Luther King gave a speech called A Time to Break Silence. I think that today, more than anything else, with what is happening in the Ukraine, we are in that place where it's time to break silence. Now, King was breaking silence on the necessity of seeking peace. And so I think it's really appropriate for us to hear again what Martin was saying. So I will use excerpts and intersperse those excerpts with where we are. So this is Martin King. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony. But we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. And we must rejoice as well. For surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is arising among us. If it is, let us trace its movement well and pray that our own inner being may be sensitive to its guidance. For we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us. Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix. When I hear them, though I often understand the sources of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known my commitment or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know that the world in which we live in is full of violence. Since I am a preacher by trade, I suppose it is not surprising that I have 7 reasons for raising the question of Vietnam. Into the field of my moral vision, I ask these questions. There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war at Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both Black and white. Through the poverty program, there were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken and eviscerated, as it were, some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as the enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. That was 45 years ago. and nothing has changed. And here we are, fully enmeshed in what's going on in the Ukraine, but not because we are seeking justice, which we should be seeking, but we're enmeshed in Ukraine because it keeps the wheels of capitalism rolling. And we are oblivious to the fact that those wheels are rolling right over our own people. And we are excited to spend hundreds of millions of dollars supporting what is an unjust war when we could have spoken years ago when the first incursion into Ukraine, and we said little and did nothing. And so now here we are, 45 years after King pointed out the debacle that Vietnam was and is, and we are doing it again. And I'm calling for us to seek peace without equivocation, without condition, but simply to find ourselves at peace with every man, woman, boy, and girl on this planet. And if we must spend hundreds of millions of dollars, let us then use them to answer the cries of our brothers and sisters who are poor, who are hungry, who are clothesless, and yes, who are not protected by the very elements of the conditions of climate that we are looking at around the world. And let us raise our voices on behalf not only of the Ukrainian people, but also of the Russian people who are dying needlessly in a conflict that is nothing more than the advancement of capitalistic ideas that have nothing to do with the necessity that we love every man, woman, boy, and girl that we are privileged to meet, and even those that we are not privileged to meet. So I'm asking you, I'm pleading you, I'm begging you, let us find ourselves at the table of peace. Let's put away the weapons of war, and let's begin to have real dialogue as human beings concerned about the condition of our brothers and sisters, but not so much in the way that we can just keep the military industrial complex in the United States moving, but that we really honor the humanity of our brothers and sisters in this conflict in Ukraine. And let's pull back from the brink of a third world war, and let's bring peace in this conflict, and then actually use dollars to aid people who have no dollars of their own, that we have here at home and that we find by the hundreds of millions all around the globe. Let us do justly by them. So I point you back to Martin Luther King and tell you that this war is unjust and that our participation in it must be that we are calling for its peaceful conclusion.
My name is Ernest L. Johnson, and I am President Emeritus of the Louisiana NAACP. I am also a law professor teaching civil rights at the Southern University Law Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I appear today in my individual capacity to thank the Schiller Institute International Conference for inviting me to be part of this meeting. The age of reason or the annihilation of humanity. I think that is a central theme for the meeting that is taking place. I believe that that message should go out to the entire world because the war with Ukraine is simply wrong. I'll say that again. The war with Ukraine is simply wrong. Now, I joined with the voices of others of good conscience to urge for a peace negotiation to start immediately in Ukraine without any precondition. A discussion of peace without any precondition. We need a peaceful solution to the conflict that currently exists in Ukraine. Creative nonviolence through direct action is the best way to achieve justice for all, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. As Dr. King has said in his plight to end the war in Vietnam in 1967, we joined with Dr. King, his words, his last speech, to urge a peaceful solution in Ukraine. And finally, I want to thank Pope Francis and the Vatican for their offer to help with the peaceful negotiations of the conflict in the Ukraine. And we encourage other religious leaders throughout the world to join with Pope Francis, and let's see if we can't get prayers going up to heaven so that blessings will come down in the form of an immediate ceasefire in the Ukraine, and that the people in Ukraine will be taken care of after this conflict is over. Thank y'all very much again.
We want to thank all three of those gentlemen for what they presented. And our final speaker for today is Mr. Sam Pitroda of both the United States and India. He is an IT innovator, telecom specialist, but he also was the advisor to 7 heads of state of the nation of India. His topic today is the potential for peace in a hyper-connected world. Sam, good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis. Ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Chicago. First of all, I want to thank Schiller Institute, Helga, and Dennis for inviting me to this event. I've been able to listen to most of the speakers, and I support and agree with everyone's voice. I'm here not to analyze Ukraine war or point fingers at someone, but I'm here, like all of us, to call for an end to this war. I come from the land of Mahatma Gandhi. I believe in non-violence. I've been a student of Gandhi all my life, and I firmly believe that the kind of killing that is going on, the kind of war we are waging, has no place in the 21st century. I want to remind all of us that for the first time in the human history, we are all connected. All 8 billion people are essentially connected with hyperconnectivity. Hyperconnectivity implies a whole lot of technologies coming together with a potential to create new civilization. Hyperconnectivity includes satellites, fiber optics, smartphones, mobile connectivity, cloud computing, robotics, analytics, big data, AI. All of these things basically democratize information, decentralize execution, demonetize services, and it is about communication, it is about content, context, and curation. Today, hyperconnectivity is changing everything around us. Trade, business, markets, distribution, delivery, products, services, finance, economy, governance. Nothing that I know of is left alone because hyperconnectivity has become pervasive. The key question now is, how do we take advantage of hyperconnectivity to take human civilization to the next level? And it cannot happen with the old mindset, old paradigm, old organizational architecture. I've just written a book called Redesign the World. This book is all about a need to rethink through the design of the world which was conceived 80 years ago that gave birth to UN, World Bank, IMF, ultimately NATO, WTO, WHO. Hyperconnectivity demand that we think completely differently. Helga has talked about her 10-point program. I have carefully reviewed it. I agree with most of it. And that is probably part of the result of looking at connected world. If you look at the history of the world, we all believe that you need some kind of a superpower to hold world together. That thinking has to change completely. Earlier in the recent history, we had British Raj, then we had US dominance, then we had bipolar world after World War II, then Soviet Union fell apart without triggering a shot. China is rising, and now we are concerned about this conflict between China and US. It is a conflict of marketplace. It is a conflict of technology development. It is a conflict of dominance. It is a conflict of economic power. However, in a hyper-connected world, you don't have to have superpower. Networks operate much better. You don't need command and control architecture. You need architecture which is more focused on collaboration, cooperation, co-creation. It is possible today to build global peace with a networking architecture. We believe all global conversation today require geopolitical balance, require understanding of markets, economy. Hyperconnectivity demands us to think very differently. I have spent my life, almost 60 years, on connectivity, and I am convinced that this is an opportunity to take human civilization to the next level. But it can only happen if we leave behind the thinking of the past, which created old design after World War II, which basically says without some kind of a power structure globally, we cannot survive. So we go on creating war. We create war in Vietnam, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it. To me, world has changed completely because of hyperconnectivity. It is more open, transparent, accessible. And today's thinking, which is predominantly focused on power and politics and power and profit, we must shift that thinking to planet and people. The need of the hour is to really take care of our planet. Planet doesn't need us. We need planet. Global warming is a crisis. Environment is a crisis. And today, we need to pay much more attention to that than send tanks to fight war in Ukraine. So if our focus shifts from power and profit to planet and people, we'll be able to pay attention to the real problem of the humanity. Environment, clean water, clean air, hunger, food security, poverty, freedom, justice, democracy. Today, there is more hate than love. Today, there is more exclusion than inclusion. The old design of the world, which was based on democracy, human rights, capitalism, consumption, and military, needs to shift to inclusion, basic human needs, new economy, because capitalism hasn't delivered equality. It has concentrated wealth in the hands of very few, and lots of people are very poor. We need more focus on consumption, sustainability, and finally, non-violence. So the request I have of all of us is that we continue to have a conversation like this. I'm glad that Pope has supported and invited people for peace talk, but lot many more people have to speak up against this sort of mindset which only wants superpower, which wants only to focus on geopolitical equations. In a hyper-connected world, borders have different meaning. Digital citizens have different rights, roles, responsibilities, obligations. And as a digital citizen, I feel it is my duty to bring to our attention that we need to get off our old mindset. Look at hyperconnectivity as a potential for peace and prosperity for all the people in the world. But it will require new organizational architecture, new mindset. Helga has been trying hard to bring all of us together, but I think our voices are not being heard. I told Helga several times that it is good to have all these conversations, but who is listening to us? They are going off and doing their own thing anyway. Pope had suggestions. Not many people are willing to accept that. So how do we get this to public conversation? How do we expand this to bring our leadership in the world, whether it is G7 or G20, to say, get off this track and get on the track of nonviolence, love, justice, democracy, human rights, inclusion. We have not built any new institution in last 80 years, similar to UN, World Bank, or IMF. We need to rebuild institutions. We need to create new institutions. That is where we need to spend more resources and not in fighting war. Ultimately, like all of you, I join you, believe in you, and feel it is time for many of us to speak up to end this bloody war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. And that was Sam Pitroda, who is an IT specialist, an innovator, and an organizer. We're now going to bring up our entire panel for a symposium discussion. We've got just under an hour for the entire discussion. And I see we have Helga, Zepp-LaRouche, Sam is there, Ray McGovern, Dr. Wolfgang Bittner is there, Nick Brana, Angela McArdle, Diane is there as well, and President Ramotar is with us. So let me start. Well, here's how we're going to divide this roughly. It'll take about 20 minutes and just get whatever responses from the panel. And we have questions that have come in. We will have some of those as well. So Helga, let me just ask first of all if you have any response to what you've heard so far.
Well, I fully agree with everybody who said we need more action, more activity, and we need it very fast. Because, you know, what I said, Austin, the Secretary of Defense saying, Austin, we have a short window of opportunity and this has to be settled in that time frame. I think that, you know, I feel that this is a heightened danger. On the other side, I amicably disagree a little bit with Sam, my really dear friend. that I do think our voices are getting heard, because we have moved a lot, because now you not only have a movement appealing to the Pope, but I think the really big new development is President Lula saying he wants to create a peace club representing 20 nations of the global south. He goes to China in March and he wants to talk to Xi Jinping about it. So there, I think we have the potential of winning this. And I think we need just to be aware that it's really a run against time. And I also agree with what Sam was saying about the future, because, I mean, on the one side, the Pope was just in Africa saying, hands off Africa, saying this colonialism must stop. On the other side, if we get over this hump, I fully agree that with, what you call super connectivity, artificial intelligence, digitalization, I mean, we can see an age where human beings will be freed up from physical manual labor and concentrate their entire life on the development of their creativity. So I feel this incredible tension between, on the one side, the danger of extinction, and on the other side, the morning of a new era of civilization. So that is a very fruitful tension to be in.
Okay, let me just ask if there's anyone else from the panel that's spoken so far has anything to respond to what was said, or any other thoughts. Ray? I think you're muted.
My wife would like to find a way to mute me. Thank you, Dennis. I was really very much struck with Sam Pitroda's notion of replacing power and profit with planet and people. There it is, folks. One thing that really hasn't been mentioned so much is the long-term effect of this war. What is happening with climate change? I would suggest that this war and its effects, well, could be described as the mother of all opportunity costs. Opportunity costs, means what we could be spending on human development, human uplift, as Dr. King would put it. This is the struggle for our planet has been set back years, and unless we stop it soon, it won't be possible to succeed. That's long term. Short term, I think Helga is exactly right. You have to listen to these people. I mean, you have to read what they say, including people like Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. There is a short term here. Dr. King also said, there is such a thing as too late. And that's where I'm just delighted to see younger people coming into the fore, arranging this monster demonstration on February 19th, and just sticking it to the world to get off their rear ends and demonstrate as before Iraq in February of 2003. Millions. This time, the powers that be in Washington may have to listen if there are tens of millions. That's up to us. Moral leadership, I applaud what the Pope has offered, his good officers to end this thing. But again, moral leadership, it's up to us right now. Annie Dillard has said, when people say there are not enough of us, well, there are enough of us. She said, there's only us. There never has been any other. So let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. And I actually want to bring in here someone who's on the line. You can't see him because of the limitations of the screen, but it's Steve Starr, who we haven't heard from before yet. He's a nuclear weapons expert, also the senior scientist for Physicians for Social Responsibility. And on this question of what happens if you have a nuclear war, I'm sure he has something to say. So, Steve, go right ahead.
Thank you for having me today. Well, I consider nuclear war to be an existential threat to humanity. I don't think this is widely acknowledged, at least publicly, by the leaders of the nuclear weapon states, which is unfortunate. And I would suggest that this should be the starting point of any discussion of arms control or anything like that. But at the very least, we should stop thinking of issuing nuclear threats simply because those can lead to a nuclear war, which would wipe out civilization, but more than that, probably most people and most animals that are land-based animals. So, and I won't go on at length about it, but that is the kind of dark cloud on the horizon of humanity right now that some people that are more aware are starting to pick up on.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just ask in specific, because several times this action of February 19th was mentioned, and Diane's not on screen right now, but she can hear us, and also Nick and Angela, if you have anything that you want to say further, sort of either in response to Ray or otherwise.
Yeah, I would like to. I'd like to say that I'm glad and grateful and thank you to the Schiller Institute, everybody, for hosting this conversation. I think the Schiller Institute has been one of the leading sources of conversation, warning the alarm bell, both in terms of these incredibly informative and galvanizing conversations, the series of conversations that have been hosted going back, of course, months all the way to the beginning of the war and years before that, but also of the disruptions. Bringing the sense of urgency that Jose, Keenan, many others, Anastasia, have actually done, Thomas. And that, in conjunction with this event that we're putting on, Rage Against the War Machine, February 19th at the Lincoln Memorial, and March to the White House that is to follow, are bringing back a fighting anti-war movement in this country that has not been able to mount an opposition in the most existential crisis that I believe that humanity has ever faced in a time of war. Hundreds of thousands of people came out against the Vietnam War and the Iraq War, and it has been crickets. And as Ray says, there is such a thing as too late. The pace at which this is escalating, there's talk about, will this become another Vietnam or Afghanistan in Ukraine? Will it just kind of persist, or the neocons going to want to keep it going forever? I don't think so. I don't think that is not the trajectory that we are on at all. We are on a trajectory, rather, that is escalating at a breaking pace, at an incredible pace. It is difficult even to keep up with all of the escalations, which are increasingly going nuclear and extremely concerning. There is an increasing school of thought on both sides that it should go nuclear. That is terrifying. Terrifying. The normalization of the idea of nuclear war, that it needs to be fought, that is somehow the next good war, is nuclear. That is insane. As Stephen has said, there is no winning a nuclear war. Even if one side were able to wipe out the entire other side before a nuke was fired, you would still have nuclear winter, which would then collapse agriculture and kill everyone. So this is existential. Humanity is increasingly being forced to make that choice about whether, as so many of the other speakers have said, we are going to take advantage of all of the fruits of the technology and the incredible wonders of scientific invention that we have, and the ability that they offer us to provide food, healthcare, housing to everyone, to allow everyone to really discover their creativity, their artistic side, their scientific side, to really emerge from the state of war that has defined humanity over the past millennia, or annihilation. That is increasingly the choice that we face, and we are on a clock. We are on a doomsday clock to make that decision. And it is up to the people who do recognize that, who can see through the media propaganda, the war fog that is clouding all of the conversation, preventing millions of people, the vast majority in this country, from ever knowing what has happened. It is up to us to bring that message to everyone else as quickly as possible, because we are in a race against time. So thank you to everybody here who is participating in that. If we are going to beat that clock, it is going to be because of the efforts that everybody who is here and everybody who is out there and everyone who is going to come rage against the war machine at the Lincoln Memorial and take our message to Joe Biden and the national security military industrial complex. It is because of what you're doing.
President Ramotar, I think you had something you wanted to say.
Just very quickly to say that while the immediate task is to try to find an end to this war, to bring conflict to an end so that we could roll back the possibility of any nuclear war, I think that we should also try to defend some of the rights that we have won over the years and that are being now totally undermined. For instance, the question of freedom of speech. I just saw recently France has banned RT from broadcasting. So more and more, the control of information is being centralized more and more. I think that we should raise our voices on that as well. So, and many people who are against the war, in particular, who are on YouTube and who are broadcasting, they have been not been able to get contribution to their stations and everything else, to try to starve them of resources from bringing another point of view up. So I think this is one area that, while we fight for end of the war, I think we should make our voices heard at the same time to defend some of those rights. And I believe now too, as we should, the threat of a nuclear war has created a condition for us to put back in a more forceful way the need to launch more emphasis on banning of nuclear weapons at this point in time. I believe you have good conditions to raise that as a concern to save humanity, to stop nuclear weapons were justified by those who had the power to do it, to say that it was keeping the peace. I don't think it is. I think it's creating a danger to the very existence of humankind or life on Earth. So I think time has come for us to try to put back that simultaneously high up on the agenda at this point in time. So thank you for your attention.
Yes. Before we go to questions, which we have, let me just ask if there's anyone from the panel that's on screen now who hasn't spoken, would like to say anything. For example, Dr. Bittner.
Yeah.
Or who's that?
I'd like to.
Okay, go ahead.
I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much for extending it to Nick and I, and for including us in this. I want to say that we feel really received by the Schiller Institute, and I want to express gratitude for that. This has been dealing with this nuclear crisis, which is really what we're at. We're not quite at the level of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we're kind of getting closer. And I think that it's an incredible test of will on the macrocosm level, watching all of these countries and officials try to sort things out, people putting out stories that are not truthful, weaving narratives, and then we have us, trying to follow that and untangle narratives and figure it all out. And then on a smaller level, we have this microcosm of individuals who are trying to work together and inform one another. And on that level, it's also a real test of will. Can we work together? Can we set aside other differences? Can we really see the big picture for what it is and understand what's at stake here? And I want to encourage everyone to continue doing that. When I'm very optimistic that we're going to make it through this. This is a dark time. It's very trying. And I feel like we're sort of flying right on the edge of our competency as humanity. Are we going to survive this? I'm very optimistic and hopeful that we are, but I think it's very close, and it should be a very serious lesson for us to all learn. But I do feel that we're going to pull through this as long as we have the force of will to work together and set aside our differences. And I hope that we can take this valuable learning experience with us into the future. And I really want to be optimistic about the future that we have. And I know that the Schiller Institute is very forward thinking about the future as well. So I want to thank you for that as well. I hope that you continue to do the good work that you do. And I do look forward to working together again in the future.
All right. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start on our questions, mainly because of time, but also, Helga, if you have any response to any of what we just heard, please let me know. The first question we have is from the president of the Rotary Club in Kiev. And this is Jean Bach, I believe. I get the name B-A-G-H, Bach. Dear friends of peace, why were, in the past 20 years, the concerns, worries, and offers for cooperation from Russia always ignored by the West? Why was it only after the beginning of the war, when the child has fallen in the well, one thinks in the West about the fate of mankind? Why do small minorities in power always have to decide the fate of mankind for a large majority? Why does one not learn from the lessons and mistakes? Will the Schiller Institute in Germany organize a meeting of like-minded people for peace with the aim of adopting concrete proposals? In peace, John Bach. So, Helga, I'll give it to you to answer.
Obviously, I mean, I think that this whole question of Germany in this conflict is a whole other issue, I mean, it is absolutely unbelievable that Germany would, for the third time, drive tanks against Russia. And we just got the letter of a former general from the GDR, who I can only advise you all to read and spread it widely, because Scott Ritter made several, and Ray McGovern, you also, several absolutely polemical interventions against the Germans. How can the Germans be so stupid, while, or coward rather? But I can only tell you, the majority of the German people, once they see a glimpse of hope, they are against the war. But they are, in a certain sense, we are still an occupied country. And I can only appeal to people like you, Ray, people like Scott, who has a language which sometimes is not so polite, but I think the Germans need a kick in the behind, because if Germany would say, the aim of this was to split Germany and Russia, this has been a long-term geopolitical aim, going back to the British and geopolitics, Mackinder, and we will not tolerate that. Anyway, so this is a very emotional issue, and I can only say that if you think about history and what the Great Patriotic War meant and means for the Russians, and how generous they were about the German unification, they did not use tanks. They took the promise not to expand NATO eastward for real. And, I find that we have a specific responsibility in Germany to correct this present thing. But, the only reason why this is happening is because, we have a government right now, especially a foreign minister and an economic minister, who are absolutely tools of the war machine. They're not representing Germany. They're like a foreign occupying power, or the mouthpiece thereof. So yes, the answer is emphatically yes. We will have a conference in Germany, and I can only invite all of you, help us, because if we would break Germany out of this present constellation, all of Europe would go in a different direction.
I believe Dr. Bittner wanted to speak. Is that the case? Yes. I think he asked, are we having our translation?
Okay.
Yes. Go ahead.
Ist stumm He's muted.
Okay, excuse me, Dr. Bittner, you're muted. Unmute.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh.
Noch betonen, dass ich
I want to emphasize that the Schiller Institute has become a very important institution for the efforts of peace in the world. And as Helga Zepp-LaRouche, we have to thank Helga Zepp-LaRouche that she is so engaged in that, and I'm astounded all the time about this intense engagement. That, and I think I realized some negative reactions as a speaker in a different conference. I have a confrontation that I'm finding astounding and scandalous because something has been done against me in Germany. This is a threat. Scott Ritter has written and talked about it. This is incredible, but we have to live with that.
Danke, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, dass Sie sich so intensiv um den Frieden bemühen, und auch den anderen Teilnehmern möchte ich danken.
I also want
einige Ray McGovern zum Beispiel seit Jahren schon und
McGovern since years, and many thanks again.
Thank you. Let me continue right now with another question, and you'll see why. This question is from Mr. David Ajetunmobi. He is the National General Secretary of the Nigeria Automobile Technicians Association. That is a professional body of micro, small, and medium-scale auto repairers in the informal sector of Nigeria economy. I really commend Schiller Institute in its agitation and struggle for a new international security and development architecture. I'm in full support. I want Schiller to also include reforming the United Nations organization as part of the agenda to bring about a new international security and development architecture. Presently, the UNO is a liability rather than an asset for global peace and development. That's his comment, and I'd like to know who on the panel would like to respond. I think he wants a response from Dr. Ramotar. Helga, if you'd like to, or anyone else.
Well, that's the contradiction I was speaking about, that we're hearing about the strong and growing economy of the United States, while at the same time their debt is 150% of their GDP. And the point I was making, that if that was happening in any other country in the world, it would have been a major crisis in dislocation in the society and everywhere. And the fact that America is not feeling that type of pressure, it's because their dollar, the dollar is one of the main currencies, or the main currency in the world today. And what has been taking place as a result of the sanctions that they have been putting on many countries, and countries trying to find an alternative, can have a boomerang effect on the United States economy that can drastically and radically in a short period of time bring down the standard of living in the country and cause a lot of problems. I think someone else, one of the presenters spoke, I think it's one of the colleagues from Germany who made the point that the United States are the most powerful military in the world, and they would not allow that to happen if because of what the consequences could mean for the ruling class in the United States. So I would say that the strong American economy is somewhat of a disguise, somewhat of a it's not really resting on very firm foundation, but resting on the fact of the dominance of the dollar on the international arena. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, Helga?
Well, I'm glad that the gentleman from Nigeria brings up the need for a new security and development architecture, because, you know, it's not enough to be against the war. It's not enough to ban nuclear weapons. And I have come to the point that I'm for banning of nuclear weapons because of the tremendous killing power of weapons of mass destruction. However, you know, the situation is more complicated than that, because if we do not eliminate the cause of why we have this war danger, and that is the pending collapse of the financial system, and in response to the weaponization of the dollar, you have the emergence of a new international currency. And that means we are in the most crucial danger period until we get to a new security and development architecture. And I think, you know, I'm very hopeful that, you know, for example, if this peace club of Lula, which he's talking about, if such a group of nations would, you know, basically put this on the agenda, I think that, you know, this is the answer to all problems of the time, because the developing countries, the non-aligned movement, are having a renaissance right now. They are picking up on the fight to end colonialism. The spirit of Bandung has re-emerged. And, you know, I think it's really high time that we move to a new world economic order, which allows for the development of all people on this planet, eradicates poverty, eradicates underdevelopment. And, you know, the new name for peace is development. This was a word created by Pope Paul VI in 1967 in his encyclica Populorum Progressio, the development of the need for all people to develop. And I think that that is something that's the only basis for peace, development for everybody. So I would hope that in, you know, this conference, but also in the next period, among, you know, the people who are fighting for peace, there should be a serious discussion, because to be against the war is the very first step. If people are not waking up to that, it's forget it. But then the question comes, how do we eliminate for good and for, you know, permanently the reasons for war? And that can only be a system of justice, of, you know, where each sovereign nation has the right to choose its own path of development, but has all the credit that they can develop. And that requires a serious discussion. And I think that's my very urgent concern, to add this question of the new security and development architecture in the debate.
Okay, very good. We have a question from Piero Trepiccione. He is the coordinator of a Catholic-run social center network for Latin America and Caribbean. And we're going to have Diane answer this one. It is, how can we obtain truthful information on Ukraine so as not to be manipulated here in the West? From Latin America and the Caribbean, what can we do to play a role against the war? And of course, President Ramotar may have something to say about it as well. But Diane, if you could start us off.
Sure. Now there's some noise here. Can I be heard okay?
Yeah, it's a little,
okay.
You're fine. You're right.
Okay, very good. Well, first of all, obviously you've come to the right place, the Schiller Institute, and the conferences that we hold, and the experts who are collaborating with Helga are a very good source of quote unquote information. But I think what we need is more than information. We need thought, and we need to have a vision of where mankind should be going, which is what Helga gets at in the 10 principles. As anyone who's been in a war has said, if you don't have a conception of what victory looks like, then how do you define winning? What is your mission? Is it simply to kill the maximum number of people? I think we tried that in Vietnam with body counts, and we didn't win that war. So there is a metric which is based on these principles. It's human. Human beings are unique. And the measure of economic success is not in dollar values, but it is in the the power of humanity over nature, to improve nature, to improve the standard of living of the population, to create the conditions where a greater and greater number of people have the potential to become geniuses. That's the purpose of economy, and that's how you measure your success. And I think we're at a point really where I think we're about to break through. I share Angela's optimism, and Helga has often expressed optimism, although I know she is aware she also has to scare us all about the danger. So it is the coincidence of opposites, I would say, because you see such a vast proportion of the world already rejecting this, and leaders of nations that we would consider quote unquote weak are having the courage to say no to the all-powerful Anglo-American, Anglo-Dutch alliance. But I mean, I think in the individual domain, people have to stand up and be seen. This is why so many of us, and we need more of us, standing up in the meetings to our congressmen, to our elected officials, to institutional officials. I don't think we should be part of audiences where someone is lying and you allow them to continue with their speech as if what they're saying is normal. When Mike Pompeo gave his speech at Texas A&M and said, I can tell you the CIA, our training is to lie, cheat, and steal. What's amazing is that 50 students didn't jump up and walk out of the room and say, we don't want to learn that. We see enough of that. So there's a quality of resistance which is based on reason and communicating a beautiful idea about mankind, also like the intervention we did in AOC's meeting, where about 15 of us got up and started singing Dona Nobis Pacem, where we have to embody a principle of truth which inspires the conscience of people around us. People are better, and we can bring that to light, and we can strengthen our numbers. So I am also optimistic, but I think the reason for my optimism is also the reason why the people who have the power to annihilate mankind are so desperate to bring on their Armageddon. So it's a real race against time.
Okay. Anyone else from the panel have anything to say about that? Okay, I'll continue with the questions. This is a question from a leader of the Christian Democratic Party in Peru. What are the chances that some NATO countries will refuse to continue supporting the United States to such an extent that NATO would stop supplying Ukraine with weapons? What countries could start this? Anyone have a view of that question? Okay, Angela first and then Ray next. I think you're muted.
I'm very curious to hear Mr. McGovern's perspective on this. I'm not optimistic that a lot of countries in Europe right now are going to do anything to shake the United States hold on NATO. The United States does most of the funding for NATO, and through that and through other means, we also subsidize a lot of European countries' militaries. And I think that that is a real problem, and that is a real barrier to dismantling NATO or scaling it back considerably.
Ray?
Well, after February 19th, it's all going to change. We're going to show our numbers, and we're not going to be disappointed. Yes, the U.S. has incredible power, but NATO requires unanimity in terms of making big decisions. And you have the Turks, and you have the Croatians, and you have the Hungarians, and you have more sensible leaders elsewhere in Western Europe that have decided that this is a little bit crazy, or maybe not just a little bit. So the best education, or the best indication that I've seen, is Biden himself at a press conference a month ago, was answering, well, what about more and more weapons? And he said, well, we're going to have many weapons as we can, but we have to do what the NATO countries will allow. And I probably said too much about that already. Well, he did say too much, because there will be limits, and there will be a lot of Europeans freezing this winter, and there will be a Russian offensive in Ukraine, which will give the lie to the notion that the Ukrainians are winning. So all these things kind of come together. I'm not a Pollyanna type, but I think that if it's up to us to agitate, and agitate is a really good word, okay? It comes from Latin, it means act, okay? It's up to us to act. And if we exercise some moral authority, and we can sort of encourage Pope Francis to do the same, I think we have to be more optimistic than we would otherwise be, and plan for the short term as well as the longer term. One last thing I'll say is I.F. Stone, the famous publicist, had this way of saying, we have to go into this with open eyes and keep our sense of humor. Here's what he said. The only kinds of fights that are worth fighting are those that you're going to lose. Because somebody has to fight them and lose, and lose, and lose, until someday somebody who believes in and has the courage to do action wins. Now, that can be a long-term prospect. As Helga has said, we have the Defense Secretary of the United States saying this has to be done in the near term, next couple of months. The U.S. is going to be faced with a situation where Russia has moved all the way to the Dnieper River. And what happens then? That's where we come in. That's where we have to prevent the worst.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Bittner? Remarks? Response? Can you unmute,
I
please?
speak German again. Do you hear me?
Yes.
The question about
the question to the goal of this war was raised several times. For me, it is clear. It is the regime change in Moscow. Germany is used at the time right now as a spearhead of NATO. Japan and South Korea against China. We have to see that on a global scale, what is happening here. For Germany, it is destructive. Big majority of the population is for peace again with Russia. I have witnessed as a child the Second World War, and it was terrible. I won't go into details, but it is known what happened then. My mother and I had to sit on a rooftop of a train from Silesia. We were forced out with 20 kilograms of packages, and we went to the so-called Golden West, to Germany, what was left of the German Empire. Most of that was lost since 1918 and was annexed by Poland, and that was a real annexation, not like Crimea. It was what there happened friendly. So facts are distorted here, and I wrote 4 books about these developments, and I wrote about that we are living in an exceptional situation in Germany. I'm suffering from that, and I know that a lot of people here want peace who suffer too on that situation. We have to change that. I am glad that there are also demonstrations in the city I am living in, and we were, denounced as theorists of and all kinds of different notions were thrown at us, but we have to come out of that situation and to move towards reasonable situation also with Russia. I thank you.
Thank you as well. We're pretty much up at the end of our period of time, but Sam, I'll come right to you in a minute. Just want to announce what we're going to do, because there's several questions that we've received. So we're going to do this two ways. One, some of them will be answerable in the next panel. Secondly, if you have not had your question answered and you have someone specific on the panel you would like to answer it, please send it back in and we will pass it on to people on the panel who will respond to you in written form. And third, what I'm going to do is to go to Sam, and then we have Jack Gilroy, who did give a presentation. He wants to say something, which I want to make sure he gets a chance to do. And then we're going to ask for summary remarks by various of the panelists. So, Sam, you're now up. Go ahead.
Thank you.
I think you're muted.
Listening to all of us.
You're muted, Sam. Oh, he is? Okay. Go ahead. Sorry, it was our problem.
No problem. No, listening to all of us, including myself, I feel that we need to really pay attention to younger people. Younger people think very differently. They have no excess baggage of World War II command and control system. They want to look at future. They want to look at peace, prosperity, jobs. And I don't think global leaders are really focused on the needs of the young. They are more focused on their power and profits of their colleagues who run businesses. And I always come back to this fundamental issue. Unless and until we move our thinking from profit and power to planet and people, there are no solutions. If you are stuck with the idea of always optimizing profit, always optimizing power, control, you will think very differently. And that's what's going on in the world today. All the world leaders only think of these two things. And how do you expect them to change? It is a big challenge for us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is, if we've got Jack Gilroy there, I think he wants to motivate our PAPL initiative, I believe. There you are. Okay, Jack.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for giving me a minute or two. I'm with Pax Christi International, Pax Christi USA, and Upstate Pax Christi, which I've organized. And we have two things really in mind that pretty much flows from what all of you have been saying. The Pope has been mentioned so many times. Helga, of course, has mentioned her, and Diane, etc. But what we are doing, we are attempting to get a strong statement to Pope Francis to have him follow up on his claim. He has made the claim that there is no just war. And for those of us who have been schooled in just war principles, it's been going on for hundreds of years. We know it's a lie. We know that it just doesn't work. And the whole movement to abolish war really is at a point now, I think, where it is a seize the moment point with Pope Francis. Last fall, he said, there is no just war, right? He said everyone should be a pacifist, right? So we want to get the Pope to try to do some of his work with President Biden, who happens to be a Catholic, and it's not a Catholic thing, obviously, but remember JFK, who was able to get along with Khrushchev. Khrushchev said it was Pope John Paul the 23rd who was really instrumental in changing his mind about giving him moral reason for turning back those missiles going to Cuba. So we have a chance now to get Pope Francis to put pressure on only the second Catholic that has ever been in leadership in the United States. Whether that would make a difference, it has to be tried. So two things then. First of all, to move the Pope toward a just war encyclical. He has not had an encyclical. This would be an amazing point in human history if he would do that. And then to get on the case of Joe Biden. So that's basically the letter that I sent yesterday to Pax Christi International and National, is to try to follow up on what all of you have been mentioning and doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jack. We're going to do now, I know, Ray, you'll be able to respond, but we're going to take sort of, as you are doing, you're going to do summary responses. And if you've heard something that you've wanted to address throughout, please feel free to do so. But we're got to wind up because we are running up against time. So I'm going to start with Angela because of what Sam posed concerning what he said. He's concerned about the issue of youth and action. So why don't we start with you, Angela? Are you there? Is she frozen? She may not be there. Okay, let's go to Nick, therefore.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. We have a generation of people, as was mentioned, that did not grow up during the Cold War, did not experience the world wars, and don't have the imprint of the memory of that and the suffering that went along with that. And it's very difficult to break through. I've spoken to others who are on college campuses about, what is the general level of awareness and what is the general, thought about the war in Ukraine. And unfortunately, there is an immense lack of knowledge of what's going on because it's not in the mainstream media. It's not a part of kind of the mainstream cultural conversation. For those who do have perspectives about it, of course, most are the mainstream perspectives given to them either from Washington, New York, the mainstream media, and Hollywood, which align itself, of course, intimately with the war machine. And so it is a big challenge. It is a big challenge at this point to break through. We do have the advantage that we have the internet, we have social media, we have independent media. It facilitates this conversation right now that can reach thousands of people. That wasn't possible just 30 years ago. And so we have to make the best of those advantages while we have them. I gave an interview just yesterday where, in fact, we spoke about how the fact that we have those advantages as people who want peace, who want a new system of development, who want to support working people, that is not something we should take for granted. Those freedoms to speak freely, to reach people through social media, through the internet, every day they are being curtailed because the internet has been identified as the enemy, essentially, as a vehicle that is allowing us to bypass those mainstream media elite institutions and communicate to each other directly. I worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign. I was the national political outreach coordinator, and I can tell you that the Bernie Sanders campaign is actually what put them on very, very high alert because they realized that Bernie Sanders went from 3% name recognition to 100% name recognition in the course of that campaign. His fundraising model was small dollar donor based, which was through the internet, crowdfunding, sustaining donations. His communications model was through social media and independent media. His ability to organize was distributed organizing, also through the internet, through apps. And so it has given us a tool to push back, but we need to make the most that we can of this tool, both to save the tool, make sure that
I did take a few notes during the course of the conversations. I would like to say that I think that our crisis now is actually more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I had a colleague who's passed away, but he was a colonel who spent 7 years on the Soviet General Staff, and he said that if we would have had the Cuban Missile Crisis today, we wouldn't have survived it, because today we have launch-ready nuclear weapons and communication systems that are, hyperactive compared to what we had back in the 1960s. So he commanded a regiment of Soviet missiles in the Ural Mountains. He was this guy, Colonel Valery Urinovich. So I guess I want to underline the danger of the situation that we're in today. And I do think it's really important to get the leaders of the nuclear weapon states in particular to publicly acknowledge and discuss the existential danger of nuclear war. It's been touched on peripherally by Putin a couple of times, I think, but it's never gone much further than that. So I hope that as part of the demands that are being made to the leadership, we need to have them acknowledge that nuclear war threatens not only the existence of civilization, but most of the people on the planet.
Thank you, Steve. Sam?
No, I don't think I have much to say, except I still believe that we need to reach out to people who really make decisions. And they have closed their ears. They are not listening. I know the pressure we are generating. I agree with Helga that, we are making a little bit of dent, but they're not willing to listen. We did this in Vietnam War time. I remember as a young boy in Chicago, and it took a long time and nobody paid attention. A lot of lip service. And we are in a very serious situation right now. That's all I can say.
Okay. Thank you. Diane?
I think that we cannot trust that the people who control the mainstream media will let us know when we are on the brink of a breakthrough. And their tactic is always to minimize what you are doing, as those of us who worked for LaRouche many years, and many people here, the political fringe. Well, if we are the political fringe, then why have they spent millions of dollars and had, I don't know how many, Ray, do you have any idea how many people are employed by these intelligence agencies in the United States? I have no idea, but it's some vast army of people.
3 million.
You can tell us, but anyway, 3 million. Okay, so 1%. Forget it. We are very powerful, and I think the biggest weakness, the biggest mistake that anyone could make, particularly an American citizen, is to underestimate the power that you have. And I want to thank Steve Starr, because I think in part the reason why such a coalition could come together on February 19th, which we'll see, we've weathered a couple tests already heading into this rally. I think there's going to be more, but the reason why people have been able to come together is because at least some of us are recognizing that it's existential, and perhaps it's more important that we make sure that we are alive first, and then we can sort out the other things which have to be sorted out. So thank you, but I really want to stress, don't underestimate the power you have as an individual.
Thank you, Diane. President Ramotar?
No, I don't have very much to say. In some areas, I'm a little bit old-fashioned, maybe because of the experience that I have. And while I agree that the internet has tremendous possibilities, and it has been proven to have that great possibility in mobilizing across generation. We saw with the WTO how many people were able to be organized. But I still believe that's why I'm very optimistic and want to congratulate those of you involved in organizing the February 19th activity. I believe that there is no substitute for directly meeting people and talking with them. And the more of that we can do it, I think it would be better. And probably, if I may say so, I might be wrong. I'm not saying I'm right. That probably that's one of the negatives of the new technology, communication technology that we have, that we're not meeting physically more to probably reinforce each other and convince other people outside of our own circles with our own thinking more. But that's what I would like to say.
Well, thank you very much for that. There are some conversations we still need to have about certain matters you and I talked about. So, Ray, you're up.
Well, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're very clear.
Okay. Each small meeting like this should end with action items. And I have a few. I think that I'd like to pick up on Pope Francis, because he is one avenue we really need to pursue, in addition to the February 19th grand mobilization. Now, I had a very unusual opportunity to be interviewed for 16 minutes on the largest religious news station in the world. It has a direct access to the Vatican. They asked me to give a little message to Pope Francis, and I said, yes, I would. And I reminded him that when he came to the United States and spoke to Congress in 2015, he said, the main problem in the world is the blood-soaked arms trade. Whoa! Wow. I reminded of that in my remarks, and I said, what happens now in Ukraine is largely due to the blood-soaked arms trade. And what you ought to do, please, Your Holiness, is to send emissaries to Washington, talk to Biden, to Paris, talk to Macron, to Germany, talk to Scholz. Tell these people, look, the military-industrial complex is driving that. We know that. People of goodwill know that. And that has to be number one, send emissaries. Who did that before? Pope John Paul II sent emissaries to the United States to talk to George W. Bush 3 weeks before the war on Iraq. He didn't get to first base. This time, we need to do that. And besides that, the Pope, encyclicals are great. I really like encyclicals. Few people read them. What the Pope needs to do, there are 1 billion, with a B, Catholics in the world. What the Pope needs to do is instruct his pastors, his bishops, upon pain of mortal sin, to tell the truth to their flock and get them mobilized, for God's sake. Encyclicals, very nice. Letters, very nice. The people in the pews need to be instructed, and pastors have to not care too much about collection plates and what the truth might do to collection plates. They have to care about spreading the truth around and suffer the consequences, if there are such consequences, and follow Jesus of Nazareth, because he didn't talk a whole lot about building churches. He talked about people pursuing justice.
Thank you, Ray. All right. Helga?
I would make the point that, it is very, very important that we evoke the memory of World War II. Because in Germany, the only people who are responding right now are people of the older generation who have the experience of war. And that is a very important asset, so to speak, because the young people, for them, war is video games and, the whole, military-industrial complex. They have developed the video games as a way to train soldiers to reduce their resistance against killer or increase the killer ratios. Video games are a side product of military training. And one of the reasons why young people are so, detached from war is because of that. It's a long discussion. I think that the idea of knowing what war would do is extremely important. And I can only thank Dr. Bittner and some of the other older Germans who are stepping forward right now to share this experience. Now, secondly, I think the lack of that experience in the United States is in large part why so many people have been condoning wars, because they were always over there. You didn't have them on your territory. And, Colonel McGregor just wrote an article where he said this time it's different, where he makes exactly that point. He said, so far, the United States were fighting against pushovers, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, whatnot. But this time it's different. This time they are up against the largest and most strongest nuclear power in the world, because Russia is actually, as a nuclear force, more strong than the United States for reasons which have to do with weapons based on new physical principles, for the time being, at least. So I think the idea that, that war would not be over there, but it would be a global war. And I think thanks to Stephen Starr that he has pointed this out. But I think that is also something which we have to get across very sensuously. So otherwise, I would just totally agree that we should concentrate all forces, or a lot of our forces, on the Pope initiative. First of all, I think that the Pope and Cardinal Parolin and the people who are also very active right now, they are aware of what we are doing, and they are completely aware of it. I have gotten responses, that this is not realistic right now, because this is not the right moment. But I also know that if we keep doing this and we really get all the pastors and the mullahs and not the imams and all the other religious denominations to join the chorus, I think we can, in the medium term, win this, because there comes the moment where the pain will become so big, and I'm afraid we will get into a big crisis. I don't think this will be avoided in a easy way. I think we will have to mobilize everybody so that in the moment of maximum crisis we can shift this. Hopefully before, but maybe not. But I think we will go into a real point of decision for the existence of humanity, and we have to prepare more and more people for that moment. And obviously, hopefully, not let it come to that, but it may. So that's what I want to say.
All right. So Sam Pitroda, Ray McGovern, President Donald Ramotar, Steve Starr, Nick Brana, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. I want to thank you for being in the panel. We also want to thank Diane Sare, Angela McArdle, Dr. Wolfgang Bittner, and also Jack Gilroy, who was with us as well. This is going to conclude our panel 1, and panel 2, The Name of Peace, A New Security and Economic Development Architecture, will begin at 2:00. We'll see you there.